Emily rose. Carter pressed her burned hands flat against the kitchen wall and told herself same as every morning that she would not cry today. Not in front of them. Not ever again. Through the cracked window, she could hear the men at the bar laughing, and she already knew the joke. It was always the same joke. It always had her name in it. She pulled her apron tight across her body, squared her shoulders, and walked back into that heat. Because a woman like her didn't get the luxury of falling apart. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow Emily's journey all the way to the end, because I promise you, she earns every bit of what's coming. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 arrived in Dust Creek, Montana, like a punishment. It came down hard and dry and mean, baking the earth into something that cracked underfoot, turning the main road into a ribbon of pale dust that coated every surface and every soul that tried to move through it. The town sat low in a valley between two ridgelines, and by mid-July the heat had nowhere to go. It just settled. It pressed down on rooftops and porches and the necks of people who had long since stopped expecting anything good from the world. Emily Rose Carter had stopped expecting things a long time before the heat arrived. She was 25 years old, and she had lived in Dust Creek her entire life. And in that entire life, she could count on one hand, one burned, scarred, calloused hand, the number of times someone had looked at her and actually seen her. Not her body, not her size, not the fullness of her hips, or the roundness of her face, or the way her arms filled out her sleeves. But her. The woman underneath all of it. She had a beautiful face. Anyone with honest eyes would admit that. Soft blonde hair she kept pinned back tight because loose hair caught fire near a cook stove, and she had learned that lesson at 15. Blue eyes the color of a winter sky, clear and sharp, and thinking always, always thinking. A mouth that curved easy toward a smile, even when smiling cost her something. Dimples even when something struck her as genuinely funny, which wasn't often these days, but hadn't always been rare. But nobody in Dust Creek looked that far up. They saw the rest of her first, and they stopped there, and what they decided in that first second was the only thing that ever mattered to them. She was heavy, substantial in a way that the frontier did not romanticize. Obese in a way that drew comments from strangers and silences from people who thought silence was the kinder cruelty. She had grown up in the knowledge that her body was the first and last thing people would ever use to define her, and she had made her peace with it, the way a person makes peace with a wound that never fully heals, by learning not to press on it and by building her life around the fact of it. The Broken Wheel Saloon had been her life for 4 years. She had walked through its back door at 21 with nothing but a recipe in her head and desperation in her chest, and she had offered to cook for room and board, and whatever wages Hector Falk, the owner, felt were fair. Hector Falk did not feel particularly fair wages were necessary for a woman in her position, and he told her so in those exact words. And she had agreed, because she had no other choice, and they both knew it. 4 years later, she was still there. She cooked breakfast before the sun came up. She cooked lunch through the worst heat of the afternoon with a fire burning 6 feet from her body and no window large enough to move the air. She cooked supper through the noise of men drinking and arguing and the occasional sound of something breaking. She cleaned the kitchen when the last plate came back. She swept the floor. She hauled her own water. She went to bed in the small room behind the kitchen that smelled like grease and wood smoke, and woke up before dawn to do it again. Dust Creek ate her food and forgot she existed. That was not an exaggeration. It was a precise, accurate description of how the town related to her. Men came in, sat down, ate everything on their plates with the kind of focused silence that meant the food was extraordinary, and then paid Hector and walked out without once considering who had made what they'd eaten. Women who came in for a noon meal sometimes sent compliments to whoever's back there, which was the closest thing to acknowledgement Emily received on a good day. On a bad day, she heard other things. Lord, does she have to squeeze past every table to bring the plates out? Hector ought to find himself a girl who doesn't eat half the profits. I heard she sleeps in the kitchen, probably eats all night. She heard them. The walls in the Broken Wheel were thin, and the kitchen door didn't seal properly, and voices carried, And the men who said these things weren't particularly concerned about being overheard because they weren't saying anything they'd have denied to her face. That was the particular cruelty of it, not that they were cowards about it. They weren't. They'd have said it straight to her if she'd given them the opportunity. They simply didn't think she warranted the energy of an addressed insult. She was background. She was furniture. She was the heat that came from the kitchen and produced the food and had no other relevant qualities. She was 25 years old, and she had never been on a single walk with a man who wasn't related to her. She had never had a flower left on her doorstep. Never had a letter written to her with something tender in it. Never had anyone hold a door open for her with the particular deliberateness that meant something more than manners. She had watched other women in Dust Creek move through the world trailing that invisible thing, that sense of being wanted, being considered, being worth a man's nervous attention. And she had understood from a young age that she would not be one of those women. The world had told her so clearly and so repeatedly that she had eventually stopped arguing with it. She cooked, she worked, she endured, and she kept her heart in a place where no one could reach it, because reaching it would only hurt them both. That was Emily Rose Carter on the morning of July the 14th, 1883. She was at the stove at 5 in the morning when she heard the argument begin. It started low, the way arguments in the broken wheel always started, a tightening of voices, a clipped exchange, the specific silence that fell when men decided to resolve something with more than words. She didn't move away from her stove. Arguments weren't her business, and inserting herself into them was one of the fastest ways to end up looking for somewhere else to sleep. But then she heard Hector's voice rise above the rest of it. "Don't care what you think you're owed, Davy Marsh. You ate the food. You pay for the food. Those are the rules and they haven't changed." The food was cold. A younger voice slurred at the edges. "I ain't paying full price for cold food." The food was not cold. "You calling me a liar in my own? This ain't your saloon." Emily stopped moving. Her hand rested on the handle of her largest cast iron pan. She listened. "Then maybe somebody needs to remind you whose town this is," Davy Marsh said, and his voice had gone very quiet, which was worse. "And whose kitchen that fat girl's cooking in." A long pause. She felt the words land the way she always felt them land, somewhere in the center of her chest, where she'd learned to absorb them. Not like a blow that knocked her back. More like a stone dropping into still water. The ripple moved through her, and then settled, and she was still standing, and she was still breathing, and she was still herself, which was the only victory that reliably belonged to her. She heard Hector's voice again, lower now. "You don't speak about my staff that way." Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly. That was unusual. "Your staff?" Davy Marsh laughed. "That woman is a charity case, Hector, and everyone in this room knows it. You keep her because she can't go anywhere else, and you pay her half what she's worth. Don't dress it up." The silence that followed lasted long enough that Emily turned back to her stove, because she knew exactly what was coming. She had heard this silence before. It was the silence of Hector calculating whether the righteous position cost him anything, and discovering that it did, and stepping back from it. "You still owe me for the meal," Hector said finally. Not a defense of her. A return to business. That was Hector. That was how it always went. Davy Marsh paid. She heard the coins hit the bar, and she heard him leave, and she heard the low hum of the saloon resume around the space where the argument had been, and she went back to her work. She was making cornbread that morning. It was something she made twice a week, sometimes more, if she'd had time to grind the meal herself, and she made it the way her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that, with a particular combination of buttermilk and rendered bacon fat, and a handful of something she didn't tell anyone about because it was hers, and it was the one thing in her life that was entirely, completely hers. The cast iron skillet went into the oven with the batter already crackling at the edges, and she closed the oven door and stepped back and waited. The smell that came out of that oven 20 minutes later was the closest thing to prayer Emily Rose Carter had ever consistently produced. She knew it. She wasn't falsely modest about her cooking. False modesty had never done her any good, and real pride in the one thing she did well was the last dignity she was going to surrender. She could cook. She could cook in a way that stopped people mid-sentence. She had watched ranchers and drifters and men who hadn't said a kind word to another human being in 6 months close their eyes after the first bite of something she'd made just for a second, just involuntarily. The way the body does when it receives something it recognizes as good. She set the pan on the cooling rack and began to slice. The noon rush came in hard. 6 ranch hands from the miller spread 2 men she didn't recognize who were passing through toward the North Old Gerald Watkins, who came every day at noon without exception and ordered the same thing, and had for 3 years, and a handful of others who filled the tables and created the noise that the broken wheel ran on. Emily moved plates through the service window. She kept her eyes on her work. She did not look through into the saloon more than she needed to, because looking caused a person to notice things, and noticing things caused a person to feel them, and she had enough to feel without adding more. She was reaching for the next plate when she heard the door open. She didn't look up. The door opened constantly. That was not a notable event, but something happened in the room that she noticed even from the kitchen. A subtle shift, the kind that moves through a crowd when something enters it that changes the atmosphere without anyone being able to say exactly why. A quieting slight, but real. A reorientation of attention. She looked up. He was tall enough that the doorframe seemed specifically designed to remind people of his height. Broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had done heavy physical work for decades and whose body had organized itself around that fact. He wore a long duster that had been expensive, once dark brown leather gone soft with use, and beneath it, a shirt the color of dark timber, and trousers and boots that were maintained with the care of someone who respected his tools. A hat, wide-brimmed practical, pushed back slightly on his head, in a way that was either casual or deliberate, and she couldn't immediately tell which. His face was the face of a man who had lived in it for a long time. Weathered in the honest way, not beaten down but shaped by sun, and by cold, and by years of squinting at distances, and making decisions that other people's lives depended on. He had a jaw that suggested he did not reconsider things once he had decided them, and dark eyes that moved through the room with the calm attention of someone who had learned that rooms could change quickly, and it was better to know what was in them. He was, Emily thought, with the detached clarity she'd learned to apply to men she would never interact with, genuinely handsome. The kind of handsome that had nothing to do with prettiness, and everything to do with the particular authority that came from being a man who knew exactly what he was. He was probably 38-40. He moved through the saloon without speaking to anyone, found a table near the window that gave him a sightline to the door, and sat down. He removed his hat. He placed it on the table beside him, with the brim up. He waited. That was the whole of it. He just waited in the way of a man who had learned that patience was not a weakness, but a form of discipline. Emily went back to her work. May. The only other woman who worked the floor of the broken wheel appeared at the service window with a slightly breathless expression that told Emily the man had been noticed. "You see him?" May said unnecessarily. "Brought his order. He wants whatever's good." May leaned on the counter. "Said it just like that. Whatever's good. Lord M." Emily sliced the cornbread. "Give him the stew and the bread." "Should I tell him the bread's fresh?" "It's always fresh. Go, May." May went. Emily assembled the plate. She was not thinking about the man at the window table. She was thinking about the stew, whether it had reduced enough, whether the ratio of the thickening was right, whether the pepper had bloomed properly. She was thinking about the afternoon bread she needed to start in an hour. She was thinking about the 3 things on her mental list that needed to be ordered from the supply wagon coming through on Thursday. She set the plate on the service counter and turned back to her stove. 8 minutes later, the kitchen door opened. Emily turned around with the immediate physical alertness of a woman who has learned that unexpected entries through her workspace are rarely good news. She had a wooden spoon in her hand, and she was already calculating exits and angles the way she always did automatically, because 4 years in a saloon kitchen teaches a woman certain instincts. The man from the window table stood in her doorway. He was bigger inside the kitchen than he had seemed from across the saloon. The room wasn't small, but he occupied it differently than the space suggested. He looked at her with those dark, calm eyes, and he did not look away. and he did not let his gaze travel down from her face, the way almost every man's gaze did that involuntary inventory, that she could feel like a physical thing, even when she was trying to ignore it. He looked at her face. He looked at her eyes, and then he looked at her hands. "You make that bread," he said. His voice was low and even, not loud, not performing anything. Emily tightened her grip on the spoon. "If there's a problem with it, no problem. I'd rather you said so straight. I don't have time to guess at complaints." "There's no complaint," he said, the same even tone. "I came back here to ask who made it." Emily looked at him for a moment. She was waiting for the rest of it, for the angle, for the correction that was coming, for the thing men actually meant when they came into her kitchen and spoke to her directly. There was always something behind it. There was always a transaction she hadn't agreed to, or a point they were working toward, or a joke she was going to be part of whether she wanted to be or not. "I made it," she said. "Thought so." He nodded slowly. "You add something to it. Something I couldn't identify." "It's my recipe." "I know. I'm not asking for it." He paused. "I just wanted to thank whoever made it. Hasn't happened enough in my life that I've eaten something that good. Seemed worth saying." Emily stared at him. The kitchen was hot around her, and the fire was going, and outside she could hear the saloon noise continuing without regard for anything happening in this room, and she was standing in front of a stranger who had just walked into her kitchen to say thank you. And she did not know what to do with that. She had no category for it. She turned it over and looked for the manipulation in it and couldn't find it, and the absence of it was so disorienting that she just stood there with a wooden spoon in her hand and said nothing for a full 3 seconds. "That's—" She stopped, started again. "You're welcome." "William Harrison," he said. Not offering a hand, she had both of hers occupied, and he'd noticed. Just giving her his name the way someone does when they think you might want to know it. "Emily Carter," she said without entirely deciding to. He nodded, looked at her hands again, not in a strange way, not in any way she could take offense at, but with the particular attention of a man who understood what marks on hands meant, what work they testified to. "You've been cooking here long," he said. 4 years. Something moved through his expression. Not pity. Not quite. Something more considered than that. "Long time," he said. "It's a job," she said with the particular flatness she used to close conversations. He heard it. She could tell he heard it because he didn't push past it the way people sometimes did when they mistook her shortness for an invitation to ask more questions. "Well," he said. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat, a small motion, a courtesy. "Thank you for the meal, Miss Carter." He left. Emily stood in her kitchen for a moment after the door closed behind him. The fire crackled. The stew shifted in the pot. From the saloon she could hear May laughing at something one of the ranch hands had said. She looked down at her hands, the scars from old burns, the roughness of daily work, the particular shape of hands that had spent years doing something specific. She turned back to her stove. But something had shifted, and she noticed it the way you notice a door that is opened in a room you thought was sealed, not dramatically, not with any fanfare, just the simple, unmistakable fact of a new space where there hadn't been one before. She did not think about William Harrison for the rest of the afternoon. She thought about him almost constantly. He came back the next day. She found out from May first, because May came to the service window with an expression Emily had learned to categorize as gleeful emergency. "He's back," May said. Emily did not look up from the bread dough she was working. "Who?" "Don't do that. You know who. The man from yesterday. Harrison." "Is he ordering?" "Already ordered. Asked if the bread was fresh." May's voice went up slightly. "I told him it was always fresh." He smiled. "Men smile at you constantly, May." This was different. He smiled like he expected it. Like he already knew it would be fresh because of who makes it. May pressed herself against the counterframe. "He asked if you were here today." Emily's hand stopped in the dough. She started again immediately. What did you tell him? I said yes. Was I wrong to? No, Emily said after a moment. No, that's fine. She made the bread. She made it the same way she always made it. Not better, not adjusted, not performed for anyone's benefit. Her recipe was her recipe, and she didn't change it for company. She slid it into the oven and set about the rest of her preparation and did not let herself speculate about why a man she had spoken to for 4 minutes was returning to a saloon in a town she was fairly certain he did not live in. The plate went out through the service window, the same as always. 20 minutes later, the kitchen door did not open. Emily did not notice she'd been waiting for it to open until it didn't. She exhaled. She told herself that was relief. She told herself she had not wanted the disruption. She turned her attention fully back to her work and kept it there through the rest of the noon rush and into the afternoon, and she did not spare William Harrison another thought. May came back at 3 o'clock with a folded piece of paper. He left this, she said, holding it out. For you, specifically. Emily wiped her hands on her apron and took the paper and unfolded it. It was brief. The handwriting was clear and considered the writing of someone who had not had much formal education, but who had put effort into the letters anyway. Miss Carter. The bread was excellent again. I believe you said it was always fresh. I believe you. W. Harrison. Emily read it twice. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket and said nothing to May and went back to her work. She kept the note. She didn't think about why she kept it. She simply found herself unable to put it in the fire, which was where she put most paper that came through the kitchen, and so it stayed in her pocket and later migrated to the small shelf above her bed, and that was where it remained. He came back 4 more times over the following week. She counted, and then was irritated at herself for counting, and counted again anyway. Each time May reported the same things. He sat at the same table, ordered the same meal, ate everything, and left. Twice he spoke with Hector briefly, transactional exchanges, nothing personal. Once he'd exchanged a few words with old Gerald Watkins, who knew everyone in a 50-mile radius and whose opinion of a man's character Emily had always found reliable. On the 5th day, she asked Gerald what he knew about William Harrison. Gerald was 83 or thereabouts and had been in Montana since before it had a name worth putting on a map. And he received Emily's question with the dignified gravity of a man who had been asked important things before. Harrison, Gerald said around a spoonful of stew. Mountain man. Has a spread up north of the valley, maybe 40 miles. Good land. His father built the original structures. Will extended them. A pause to chew. Lost his wife some years back. Elsie Harrison. Good woman. Fever took her in the 3rd year of their marriage. Emily was quiet. He comes through Dust Creek maybe 3-4 times a year for supplies. Doesn't stay. Doesn't drink much. Doesn't cause trouble. Gerald looked at her with eyes that were old and careful. Why do you ask Emily? He's been in several times this week. Has he? Gerald's expression moved toward something she couldn't quite read. He eating well? He seems to be. Gerald looked down at his stew and said nothing more. That afternoon, Hector Falk came into the kitchen. He was a wide man with small eyes and the specific disposition of someone who had built a modest enterprise and was perpetually suspicious that it was about to be taken from him. He had treated Emily with the particular management style of someone who considered an employee's limited options to be the primary qualification for their position. He was not a cruel man in any dramatic sense. He was just the ordinary kind of unkind, the kind that doesn't think about it much. Harrison, Hector said, leaning in the doorway. William Harrison. You know who he is? I've heard the name. He's been asking about you. Emily turned from the stove. Asking what? Whether you work here permanent, whether you do any work outside the kitchen. Hector's small eyes were doing their calculation. I told him you were employed here full-time. That's accurate. He seemed to think maybe you'd have time for additional work, on the side. Hector crossed his arms. I told him we keep our staff busy. Emily looked at him carefully. Did he say what kind of work? Said he was looking for someone to help set up a proper kitchen operation on his spread. Said he'd been eating camp food for 2 years since his cook quit, and he was tired of it. Hector shifted his weight. I told him you weren't available. The word settled between them. Emily heard it for exactly what it was. Not protectiveness, not loyalty, but property management. The same thing Davy Marsh had said last week in a different language, the same claim being made by different mouths. She was Hector's cook the way the stove was Hector's stove. You told him I wasn't available, she repeated. That's right. And if he comes and asks me directly, Hector's eyes went small and flat. Then I'd expect you to tell him the same thing. Given that I provide your housing and your wages and your meals. Emily turned back to her stove. Yes, sir, she said with nothing in her voice at all. Hector left. She stood at the stove with her hands braced against the edge of the work table, and she breathed, and she let the feeling move through her and settle, and she looked at what it left behind. She had spent 4 years being grateful for what she had, because she had been taught to be grateful for it. She had a roof and food and wages, which was more than some people had, and less than most people needed. She had learned to make that arithmetic work in her favor, and she had done it so consistently that she'd stopped noticing that it was arithmetic and started believing it was the truth. But Hector had just walked into her kitchen and spoken to her the way you speak about an arrangement, a ledger entry, a resource. And the thing that came up in her after he left wasn't gratitude. It was something older and sharper and much harder to put back. She made supper. She made it well. She always made it well because she had her standards, and her standards were her own, and no man's attitude toward her was going to get into her cooking. But her hands were shaking slightly, which they did not usually do, and she noticed that and filed it away. William Harrison came back the following morning. He didn't sit at his table this time. He stood at the bar and spoke quietly with Hector for a few minutes, and from her position she couldn't hear the specifics, but she could hear the register of it. 2 men having a business disagreement, low and careful, the way men who are used to getting what they want negotiate when they encounter unexpected resistance. Then Hector pointed toward the kitchen. Harrison looked in the direction Hector pointed. His eyes met Emily's through the service window for 1 flat second before she turned away. She heard the kitchen door. Miss Carter. She didn't turn around. I was told I'm not available. I know what you were told. His voice was steady. I'm asking what you'd say. She set down the pan she was holding, turned to face him. He was standing just inside the doorway, hat in his hands this time, which she filed away as deliberate. You want to hire me, she said. Yes. Hector says I'm employed here full-time. Hector says a lot of things. A pause. I'm not talking to Hector, I'm talking to you. Emily looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was hot around them. She was aware of how she looked flour on her arms, apron worn and gray at the hem, hair pinned back tight. She was aware of what he saw when he looked at her, or what she assumed he saw, because she had spent 25 years learning to assume it accurately. You need a cook, she said. I need someone who can run a proper kitchen. I have a ranch, 12 men, supply lines that work if someone manages them right. I haven't had any of that organized in 2 years. He wasn't selling it. He was just describing it the way you describe a situation that needs addressing. And you came to me. I came to Dust Creek for supplies. I ate in this saloon because it was here. He held her gaze. But I came back because of what you made. Emily studied him. What are you offering? She said. He named a wage. She controlled her expression carefully because the number he named was more than double what Hector paid her, and she had made her feelings about Hector's wages into something quiet and buried a long time ago, and suddenly they were not quiet at all. That's for a cook, she said carefully. That's for someone who can run a kitchen and manage provisions for a working ranch. It's skilled work, and I pay skilled wages. He looked at her steadily. You'd have your own room, your own space. You eat at the table with everyone else. At the table with everyone else. Such a small thing, such an absolute foreign thing. She pushed down whatever it was that tried to rise in her chest when he said it. "I've been here 4 years," she said. "I have an arrangement with Hector, an arrangement that he describes as your permanent employment, without having asked you whether it was permanent." He wasn't pressing. He wasn't urgent about it. He was just naming the thing she'd already identified. "I'm not telling you what to do, Miss Carter. I'm giving you information that wasn't offered to you. What you do with it is yours to decide." Emily looked at her hands. Her burned, scarred, calloused hands that had cooked 4 years of extraordinary meals for a town that had never once said her name with the particular weight of someone who thought it mattered. She looked up. "When would you need an answer?" she said. "I'm leaving the day after tomorrow," William Harrison said. "I'll be at this saloon for breakfast. If you're here, I'll assume you've decided to stay. If you're not—" He stopped. Let it rest there unfinished. Let her understand what the unfinished part meant without him having to say it. He put his hat back on. "Thank you for hearing me out," he said. "I know it wasn't asked for." He left. Emily stood in her kitchen in the heat and the smell of a morning's work already done, and she thought about the note she'd kept on the shelf above her bed, and about an old man's measured silence when she'd said Harrison's name, and about a wage that was more than double what she was making, and about 4 years of not crying in front of them. Then she turned back to her stove, because she had work to finish, and because decisions made in the middle of the morning in the heat of a saloon kitchen were not decisions she trusted, and she needed the night to find out what she actually wanted, or more precisely, whether she was still capable of wanting anything at all. Emily Carter did not sleep that night. She lay on her narrow cot behind the kitchen with her eyes open and the heat pressing down on her like a living thing, and she ran the numbers the way she always ran numbers when she couldn't quiet her mind methodically, honestly, without the comfort of wishful thinking. 4 years, double the wage, her own room, a table where she ate with everyone else. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall and told herself she was being foolish. She turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling and told herself she was being practical. She turned onto her side again and stayed there until the sky began to gray at the edges, and she gave up on sleep entirely and got up and started the fire. Because that was what she did. That was who she was. When everything else failed her, she worked. She made biscuits that morning that were by any objective measure the finest biscuits she had ever made in her life. She didn't know if that was defiance or grief, or the particular focus that comes when a person has been awake all night with a decision and needs their hands to be busy while their mind finishes its work. The biscuits came out golden and layered, and the kitchen filled with a smell so good that May appeared in the doorway a full hour before her shift started. "Lord M," May said. "What happened?" "Nothing happened. There are biscuits." "Something happened." May leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with the careful attention of a woman who had been paying attention to Emily Carter for 3 years and knew the specific shape of her silences. "You look like you spent the night with a decision." Emily set a biscuit on a plate and handed it to May. "Eat." May ate. Her expression shifted in the way it always did when she ate Emily's cooking, that involuntary honest softening that Emily had learned to recognize as the only feedback that meant anything. Then May looked up. "What did Harrison say to you?" May said. Emily was quiet for a moment. "He offered me work," she said. "On his ranch." May was very still. "What kind of work? Running his kitchen? Managing provisions for 12 men?" Emily wiped her hands on her apron. "He's leaving tomorrow. Day after, I mean. Today's the day before." May put down the plate. "And you're considering it?" "I'm thinking about it." "Emily." May stepped fully into the kitchen, lowered her voice. "Hector finds out you're considering this, he'll make your life very difficult. My life already is very difficult. More difficult." Emily looked at her. "I know. And you're still thinking about it." Emily looked at the biscuits cooling on the rack. She looked at the kitchen around her, 4 years of her life, accumulated in the scorched edge of the work table and the particular way she'd arranged the spice shelf, so everything was reachable left-handed, because she'd burned her right hand in the first month and learned to compensate and never fully uncompensated. 4 years of her body in this room. "I'm still thinking about it," she said. May nodded slowly, the kind of nod that contains a lot more than agreement. Then she picked up her plate again and finished her biscuit in silence, and Emily went back to her work, and neither of them said anything else, and somehow that was enough. Hector found out by 9 in the morning. She didn't know how the broken wheel had the particular social ecology of any closed system where information moved through walls and around corners by mechanisms that defied explanation, and by 9 o'clock, Hector Falk was standing in her kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has discovered that something he considered settled was not. "I hear Harrison came back here yesterday," Hector said. Emily was stirring a pot and did not stop stirring. "He comes back most days." "To the kitchen?" "Yes." "You didn't tell me he'd been to the kitchen." "You didn't ask." A pause. She heard him shift his weight. "What did he want?" "He told me what he told you," she said, "that he's looking for a cook for his ranch." "And I told him you weren't available." "Yes, you told me that." "And what did you tell him?" Emily lifted the spoon, tasted, added a pinch of something from the shelf, replaced the spoon. "I told him I'd think about it." The silence that followed was the kind that has a temperature. "You told him you'd think about it," Hector repeated. "That's what I said, Emily." He came further into the kitchen now, which he rarely did, and she turned to face him, because she had a policy about not having her back to a man when his voice sounded the way Hector's voice currently sounded. "You work for me. I house you. I feed you. I have kept you employed for 4 years when there isn't another establishment in this town that would have taken you on." She heard every word of that. Every single word, including the ones he hadn't said out loud. "I know that," she said. "Then you know that going off to cook for some mountain man who came through here 3 times and decided he liked your cornbread isn't a serious proposition. You know that." "He offered me a wage," Emily said. "I'm sure he did. Double what you pay me." Hector's expression shifted into something that was trying to look like concern and was mostly something else. Emily, a woman alone, 40 miles north in the mountains, 12 men she doesn't know. She looked at him steadily. "You're worried about my welfare." "I'm being practical." "You're being practical," she repeated in the same even tone. "The way you were being practical when you told him I wasn't available without asking me. The way you were being practical when Davy Marsh called me what he called me last week and you told him he still owed you for the meal." Hector's jaw tightened. "That was different," he said. "It wasn't different." She held his gaze. "I appreciate that you've employed me, Hector. I mean that honestly. But I'm going to think about Mr. Harrison's offer, and I'll let you know what I decide." "If you leave this kitchen," Hector said, and now his voice had dropped into the register of someone removing the pretense, "don't expect to come back to it." Emily nodded. "I understand. I mean that. You walk out for Harrison, you've made your choice." "I understand," she said again. He stared at her for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back out through the kitchen door, and his footsteps crossed the saloon floor, and she heard his office door close, with the particular emphasis of a man who has not gotten what he came for. Emily turned back to the stove. Her hands were shaking again, just slightly. She pressed them flat against the edge of the work table until they stopped. She had never spoken to Hector Falk that way. Not in 4 years. She had always calibrated herself inside the boundaries of what he considered acceptable, because the alternative was unemployment, and she had not until approximately 12 hours ago had any reason to reconsider that calculation. Something had changed overnight. She pressed her hands flat and breathed, and tried to identify what exactly had changed, because she needed to understand it before she acted on it. What she came to slowly standing at her work table with the fire going and the morning already deep into itself was this: William Harrison had walked into her kitchen and spoken to her like she was a person who had options. Not like she was lucky to have what she had. Not like her situation was fixed. like she was someone who could be offered something and could choose. And the act of being offered a choice, a real one, not a performance of one, had done something to the way she was able to see her own life. The arithmetic she'd made work for 4 years didn't work the same way anymore. The numbers came out different. And she didn't know yet what she was going to do about that, but she knew she couldn't unsee it. He was at his table at 7:30 the next morning. She saw him through the service window when she was pulling the first bread of the day from the oven. That table near the window, that particular posture hat brim up on the table beside him. He had a cup of coffee that May had brought, and he wasn't drinking it yet. He was looking at the window, outside or at the glass. She couldn't tell. May appeared. "He's here. I see him. What are you going to do?" Emily carried the bread to the rack. "I'm going to finish the morning bread. Then I'm going to plate his breakfast. Then I'm going to decide." May looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Em, you're the best cook I have ever known. You are the best person I have ever known. And you have been in this kitchen for 4 years, and no one here has ever once told you either of those things." Emily went still. "I'm not saying leave," May said. "I'm not saying stay. I'm just saying you deserve someone who notices what you're worth, without having to be asked to." Emily looked at the bread on the rack, at her hands. At the worn edge of the apron she'd been wearing so long, the strings had been retied twice. "Go take his order," she said. May went. Emily made breakfast. She made it the same way she made everything, with the full weight of her attention and her skill, and without performing it for anyone. She was not going to make William Harrison's breakfast better than her best, because she was trying to impress him. Her best was already her best. That was not something she adjusted for company. The plate went out through the window. She untied her apron. That was the moment she knew. Not when she walked out. Not when she opened the kitchen door. The moment she untied the apron and set it on the hook by the stove, that was when she understood what she had already decided somewhere in the night, without fully admitting it to herself, until her hands were already moving. She pushed through the kitchen door and into the saloon. It was early enough that the room held only a few men, most of them still working on coffee, and not yet requiring much from the world. She was aware of the shift that happened when she walked out from the kitchen, the way people noticed the slight recalibration of attention, because Emily Carter came out from behind the kitchen door approximately never, and her presence in the saloon proper was unusual enough to register. She walked to the window table. William Harrison looked up from his plate. She stood across the table from him and said without preamble, "I have conditions." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "All right," he said. "I manage the kitchen my way. My organization, my methods, my recipes. I don't take direction on cooking from anyone who doesn't know how to cook, and I'll tell you straight out when that's the case." "Fair," he said. "I eat at the table with the rest of the ranch, not after, not separate." That was already what I offered. "I know. I'm making sure we both understand I mean it as a condition and not just a nicety." She kept her eyes on his. "I need 2 days off a month. My choice of which days." "Done. And I need to know—" She stopped. She had to push through the stop because it required her to say something that felt dangerously close to a want, and she had kept her want small and private for a very long time. "I need to know that if I decide it isn't working, I can say so, without it becoming a situation." Harrison looked at her steadily. "You can leave any time you want. I'll have someone take you back to town. And you won't make it difficult." "Miss Carter," he said, and something in his voice had gone quiet in a way that required her full attention. "I'm not in the business of making things difficult for people who've decided to leave. And I'm not in the business of keeping people who don't want to be somewhere." He held her gaze. "You have my word. For whatever that's worth to you coming from a man you've known less than a week." Emily looked at him. She assessed him the way she assessed everything, carefully, honestly, without the interference of what she wanted to be true. He looked back at her. He didn't fidget. He didn't add more. He'd said what he had to say, and he was waiting with that specific patience she'd identified in him the first day, the patience of a man who understood that other people needed time to arrive at their own conclusions, and that rushing them was a form of disrespect. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "I leave this afternoon. After the noon meal. I'm not leaving Hector in the lurch with the lunch crowd." Harrison nodded. "I can wait." She stood there for a half-second longer than she needed to, because she had just agreed to go 40 miles north into the mountains with a man she'd exchanged maybe 600 words with in her life, and even if it was the right decision, it was still a large one, and she needed a moment to let its size be real. Then she turned and walked back to her kitchen. She had work to finish. The noon meal was the finest she had served in 4 years at the Broken Wheel. She didn't plan it that way. It happened because she was in the kitchen, and the food was in front of her, and her hands and her attention were on the work. And when those 3 things aligned without distraction, what came out of Emily Carter's kitchen was extraordinary, and that was simply what it was. Roasted beef, with the particular depth of flavor that came from a long morning's work. Fresh bread, a second bake. A bean dish with smoke in it that she'd been developing for 2 months and had finally gotten right today, on this day, which struck her as a specific kind of terrible timing, and a specific kind of rightness all at once. May carried plates with an expression that cycled between sadness and pride, and something Emily couldn't fully categorize. The room ate. The room was quiet in the way it always got quiet when the food was exceptional, that absorbed focused silence. That was the highest compliment she'd ever received, and which no one in that room would have articulated as such. She cleaned her station. She washed the pots. She dried them and put them back where they went. And then she stood for a moment in the kitchen she had occupied for 4 years, and looked at the shelf where she kept her spices and her knives, and the small collection of worn recipe cards written in her mother's handwriting that were the most valuable things she owned. She took the recipe cards. She left everything else. The spices were Hector's technically. The knives were hers, and she took those. The recipe cards were hers in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with inheritance, and those she wrapped in a clean cloth and tucked into the bag she'd packed before dawn. May found her in the kitchen one more time. May didn't say anything. She just put her arms around Emily, brief and fierce, and Emily stood in it for one moment and then stepped back because she was not going to cry here. She was not going to cry in front of them. "Write me," May said, "or find someone who'll carry a word." "I will." "Em!" May's voice had gone rough at the edges. "Don't come back unless it's because you want to. Not because it's familiar. Not because it's safe. Only if you want to." Emily looked at her. "I'll remember that." She picked up her bag. She walked out through the kitchen door and across the saloon floor and through the front door of the Broken Wheel Saloon, and she did it without looking back, because looking back was a thing she had done enough of, and she was tired. Harrison was waiting outside with 2 horses. He'd arranged one for her without being asked, a steady-looking roan mare with a broad, sensible build and an unbothered expression that Emily found immediately appealing. He helped her secure her bag without making a production of it. He handed her the reins and then went to his own horse and mounted without ceremony. "Ready," he said. Emily settled into the saddle. She hadn't ridden in 3 years. There was no occasion for riding when you never left a building, but the body remembered, and the mare was patient, and she found her seat with less difficulty than she'd expected. "Ready," she said. They rode out of Dust Creek at 1:30 on a July afternoon northward, toward the mountains, into heat that thinned as they climbed, and a sky that opened wider than anything Emily had been able to see from a kitchen window. She did not look back. They rode for most of the afternoon with the kind of quiet between them that Emily spent the first hour analyzing for threat. Was it uncomfortable silence? Hostile silence? The silence of a man running a calculation she couldn't see, and spent the second hour simply inhabiting, because she'd run out of threat to find in it. It was just quiet. He rode beside her with about 10 feet of space between them, and he watched the trail, and she watched the trail, and occasionally he pointed out something relevant to their route, without the unnecessary accompaniment of commentary. Around 3 o'clock he said, "We'll stop at the creek ahead for the horses." "All right," she said. They stopped. She dismounted with more grace than she'd expected, which was something to note quietly and without making anything of. She watered the mare and walked a little to ease her legs, and he did the same, and they reconvened at the horses without discussion. "How far?" she said. "4 more hours roughly. We won't make it before dark if we don't push the pace." She looked at the sky. "Then we push the pace." He looked at her, a brief look but with something in it she couldn't read. "All right," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not surprised exactly, but something adjacent to approval that wasn't trying to be approval, that she didn't know what to do with, and filed away anyway. They pushed the pace. The mountains were genuinely beautiful, and she noticed that without intending to, the way you notice something that has nothing to do with anything you've been arguing with yourself about. Just the simple, factual beauty of a place that hadn't been diminished by human opinions of it. She hadn't seen open country in 3 years. She hadn't known she missed it until she was in it again. Around 6 o'clock, with the light going golden and long, Harrison said, "Can I ask you something?" She was aware that the sentence was constructed as a question, permission requested, not assumed. "Go ahead." "Why did you stay 4 years?" She considered the question. He deserved the honest version, she decided, not the shortened one. "Because I had nowhere else to go when I got there, and because it took me that long to understand that nowhere else to go is a temporary condition, not a permanent one." He was quiet for a moment. What changed? She kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "Someone offered me a choice," she said. "Made me realize I still had them." He didn't respond to that directly. But after a moment, he said quietly, "I should have said this earlier. My ranch, it's not fancy, it's working land. The men are decent, but they're ranch hands, and it can be rough company. I've worked in a saloon for 4 years. Right. A pause. I just want you to know what you're riding toward." She glanced at him sideways. "What am I riding toward?" He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it, that he didn't reach for something easy. "Hard work," he said finally. "Fair pay. People who'll judge you by what you do, and not by anything else." Emily looked at the trail. "That's more than most people get," she said. He nodded. No argument. They rode. It was past 7 when the ranch came into view, and even in the fading light, Emily could see the particular organization of it, not sprawling, not careless, but laid out with the considered practicality of someone who had thought about how work should move through a space. The main house was long and low, and showed additions in stages, which meant it had been built by someone who expected to grow and had planned accordingly. Outbuildings neat. A bunkhouse with a light showing. She noted all of this without stating any of it. The men came out when they heard horses. Not all of them. It was late, some would be asleep, but 4 or 5 materialized in the gathering dark, and she sat her horse and looked at them, and they looked back at her with the frank appraisal of men who work together in isolation and view new arrivals as data to be processed. Harrison dismounted. "This is Miss Carter," he said, to no one specifically, and therefore to all of them. "She'll be running the kitchen. You have questions about food or supplies, you ask her. You have opinions about her cooking. You keep them to yourself unless they're helpful." One of the men, young with the unguarded face of someone who hadn't yet learned to filter his expressions, said, "Does she? Unless they're helpful," Harrison said again, in exactly the same tone. The young man closed his mouth. Emily dismounted. She stood on her own feet on ground that wasn't the broken wheel saloon and felt the specific weight of the moment, not dramatic, not triumphant, just real. The ground under her feet, the cooler air, the smell of pine and horses, and a fire somewhere close. An older man stepped forward. He had a gray beard and the kind of face that had been weathered into something close to kindness. "Tom Briggs," he said. "I've been feeding the crew from a camp stove for 2 years. I will not pretend I'm anything other than grateful you're here." Emily looked at him. "What have you been feeding them?" "Beans," he said. "Beans and salt pork and whatever we can source, and I won't tell you the details because I think it would distress you." "It won't distress me," she said. "I need to know what I'm working with." Tom Briggs looked at her for one moment with an expression that was specifically the expression of a man who has just recalculated something. Then he smiled slightly and said, "Come look at the kitchen." The kitchen was rough. She had expected rough, and rough was what she got: a large work table that had been used hard and maintained indifferently, a stove that needed its connections, checked a larder that told the story of a crew subsisting rather than eating. She walked through it in the near dark, with Tom carrying a lamp, and she inventoried it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to assess a kitchen the way a doctor assesses a patient, not judging, just diagnosing. "Well," Tom said. "I need a new work table," she said, "or this one resurfaced properly. That stove needs its joints checked before I run it hard. Your spice supply is almost nothing, but we can build that. The larder structure is fine if we restock it right." Tom looked at her. "How long till we eat well?" "Come to breakfast tomorrow," Emily said. "I'll tell you after that." He laughed, short, genuine, surprised, and it was such an unperformed sound that Emily filed it away in the specific collection of things that had surprised her that day, which was becoming a collection of unusual size. She found her room small, private, with a window that looked toward the tree line and a door that locked from the inside, which she tested twice out of habit. She set her bag on the bed. She took out her mother's recipe cards and set them on the windowsill where she could see them. She sat on the edge of the bed. The ranch was quiet around her. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but inhabited the sound of a place where work happened and people slept so they could do it again. A horse shifting in the stable. Wind in the pines. Somewhere distant, what might have been a coyote. She sat in it and let herself feel the size of what she'd done today. Let herself feel the fear underneath the practicality, because it was there and pretending it wasn't would only give it more power. She had left the only employment she'd had in 4 years. She had ridden 40 miles with a man she barely knew. She was in an unfamiliar place surrounded by strangers. She was also sitting in a room with a door that locked from the inside, and a window that looked toward mountains, and a kitchen that had room to become what she needed it to be. And tomorrow morning, she would walk into that kitchen and make something and find out what she was working with. She had conditions she'd named out loud and had been met with. She had named her worth in plain terms and had not been laughed at. She lay back on the bed without undressing and looked at the ceiling and thought about May's voice saying, "You deserve someone who notices what you're worth without being asked." And she stayed with that thought for a long time, in the dark, in the quiet, in the room with the locking door. She did not run the arithmetic this time. She just let the thought exist. She was up before dawn. She had set no alarm because she never needed one. Her body kept its own schedule with the reliability of a working clock, and 4:30 found her awake and sitting on the edge of the bed and then moving before she'd fully decided to move the way she always did, because motion was easier than thought first thing in the morning, and she had always been grateful for that. She checked the stove. The joints were not as bad as she'd feared in the dark. She started the fire with the particular practiced efficiency that her body performed while her mind was still catching up to the day. She found the flour. She found the lard. She found eggs that were fresh, good sign, and salt, and a few things she hadn't expected to be there, including a small jar of sorghum that she held up and examined with something close to respect. She started biscuits. She started bacon from a side she found hanging properly cured and correctly stored, which told her something about Tom Briggs's basic competence, even if the kitchen around him had suffered from neglect. She found potatoes and started those as well. She assessed the coffee pour, but present, and started a pot. She was 40 minutes into cooking when the smell arrived. She always knew when the smell had reached the rest of the building because of what happened next, which was exactly what happened now, the sound of men waking. Not alarms, not shouting, just the sequential sounds of human beings responding involuntarily to the signal that something good was happening in the kitchen, and it was happening now, and it required their presence. Tom Briggs appeared first. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his suspenders with his boots unlaced, and he looked at the stove, and he looked at Emily, and he said nothing at all for a full 5 seconds. Then he said, "Lord Almighty." "Sit down," Emily said. "Coffee's ready." Men arrived in stages over the next 20 minutes, some fully dressed, some still pulling themselves together, all of them oriented toward the kitchen, with the specific pull of people responding to something they hadn't had in a long time. She watched them from the stove and filed them away, names she didn't know yet. Faces she was learning to categorize the particular social geometry of a group that had worked and eaten together long enough to have an established order that she would need to understand before she could navigate it. Harrison came in last. He was fully dressed, which she noted because it told her something about his habits he hadn't rushed. He'd taken time. He came in and looked at the table where his men were sitting with food in front of them, an expression on their faces that she recognized the involuntary stillness of people eating something that deserved attention, and she watched him take that in. Then he looked at her. She was at the stove with her back mostly to the room, and she felt his gaze the way she'd learned to feel attention as a shift in the ambient pressure of a space accurate without being dramatic about it. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She brought his plate herself, because Tom, who was nominally helping, was occupied with his own biscuit in a way that precluded multitasking. She set the plate in front of Harrison and turned to go back to the stove. "Miss Carter," he said. She turned back. He looked at the plate, then at her. "You didn't have to start this early." "I wanted to know what I was working with," she said. "Now I know." And she considered him for a moment. The table full of quiet men. The kitchen that needed work but had the bones of something functional. The window light coming in at an angle that was specific to this place and nowhere else. "It'll do," she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else she had a word for. "Good," he said. She went back to the stove. And for the first time in 4 years, Emily Rose Carter cooked a meal in a kitchen that felt in some early tentative way she was not yet ready to name out loud like it might belong to her. The first week at the Harrison Ranch passed the way first weeks always pass when a person is learning a new place in layers each day, peeling back something the day before had hidden. Emily learned the kitchen in the first 2 days. Not just where things were, but how the space breathed, which corner ran cold in the morning, which wall the wind came through when it turned north, where the light hit best in the afternoon, and where it disappeared entirely. She learned the stove's particular temperament, the way it ran hot on the left side and needed adjustment for anything that required even heat. She learned which of the 12 ranch hands ate fast and which ate slow, which ones came in dirty and needed reminding about washing up before they touched her table, and which ones were already scrubbed and quiet and grateful in the specific way of men who had been eating badly for a long time, and understood the difference now that it had changed. She learned Tom Briggs in pieces, and what she learned she mostly liked. He was 60-something, with a bad knee that he never mentioned, and a dry wit that emerged only when he trusted a person enough to risk it. And by the end of the 3rd day, he had decided to trust Emily Carter enough to let it out occasionally, and she discovered that she was glad for it in a way she hadn't anticipated. What she didn't learn, what remained stubbornly consistently opaque, was William Harrison. He was at every meal. He sat at the head of the table without making a production of it, in the way of a man whose authority over a space is so settled that it doesn't require demonstration. He ate everything she put in front of him with the focused appreciation she'd identified in the saloon, that quality of attention he gave food that she had never seen any other man give it, as if eating were a thing worth doing properly. He said thank you every single time, not as a formality, as a fact. But he didn't linger. He didn't ask questions that were actually something else in disguise. He didn't find reasons to be in or near the kitchen. He ran his ranch, which was substantial work that took him out early and brought him back late. And what happened between those 2 points was not visible to Emily, and she told herself firmly that she had no interest in making it visible. She almost believed herself by the 4th day. On the 5th day, Everything complicated. It started with a rider. Emily was in the kitchen mid-morning when she heard horses come in fast, which was different from the normal rhythm of ranch horses. And she looked through the window without meaning to, and saw a man she didn't recognize, dismounting with the particular controlled urgency of someone carrying bad news. He went straight to the main house. She heard the front door. She heard voices too low to make out from the kitchen, and then Harrison's voice, which she could identify now, even at a distance. Tom came in from outside about 10 minutes later with his jaw set. "What happened?" Emily said. Tom looked at her for a moment. "You hear things fast." "I hear things that sound like bad news. What happened?" He came further into the kitchen and lowered his voice, even though there was no one else present. "That's Cal Deering's rider, from the South Valley spread." A pause. "Deering's been putting pressure on Harrison for 6 months over the North Pasture line. Says the survey's wrong. Says 200 acres that Harrison's been running cattle on for 12 years belong to Deering by the original land grant." Emily set down what she was holding. "Does he have a case?" "He has a lawyer in Helena, and money enough to make a case out of anything." Tom's expression was flat. "Harrison's got the working survey and 12 years of deed payments and a judge in Dust Creek who's fair. But fair doesn't always matter when the other side has a Helena lawyer and friends in the territory office. What does Deering want?" "What he always wants. He wants Harrison to sell at a low price and call it settled." Tom looked at the table. "Will's not selling. Never was. Deering knows it. So now he's found a different angle." Emily was quiet. She was filing all of it in the careful, organized way she filed things that mattered. "What's the different angle?" Tom looked at her with something careful in his face. "He's claiming Harrison brought a woman up here under improper circumstances. That it reflects on Will's character in ways that ought to concern the territorial court." Emily went very still. The kitchen was quiet around her. The fire ticked. Somewhere outside a horse called and wasn't answered. "He's using me," she said, not a question. "He's using the fact of you." Tom met her eyes. "I'm telling you because you should know. Will doesn't know I'm telling you. He'd probably tell you himself, but in his own time, which might not be fast enough for you to make your own decisions." Emily looked at the work table. She looked at her hands. "How bad is it?" she said. "Depends on whether Deering's got anyone willing to testify. He doesn't have anything real, but real and provable aren't always the same thing. And this is Montana territory, and a woman living on a man's ranch without family or a clear formal arrangement is—" He stopped, started again. "People make assumptions. People always make assumptions about women like me," Emily said with a flatness that had nothing angry in it, just the bone-deep accuracy of long experience. Tom was quiet. "All right," she said. She picked up what she'd set down. "Breakfast will be on the table at the usual time." Tom blinked. "That's all you've got to say?" "That's all I've got to say right now." She looked at him directly. "Thank you for telling me." He studied her for a moment with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't expected. Then he nodded and went out, and Emily turned back to the stove, and her hands were not shaking this time. They were very steady, which was worse somehow. The shaking was feeling. The steadiness was something that had gone past feeling into a place she recognized from difficult years. The specific controlled calm that descends when a person realizes the thing they feared has arrived. And there is now only the question of what to do about it. She had known. She had known somewhere below the practicality of the decision that being a plus-size woman alone at a widower's ranch was a thing the world would have opinions about. She had known it and decided anyway, and she did not regret deciding. But knowing a thing and having it arrive in your kitchen as an actual weapon aimed at an actual man were different experiences entirely. The question she needed to answer, and needed to answer before Harrison came in for the noon meal, was whether she was going to let that weapon land. He came in at noon, the same as every day, and he sat down and she brought his plate, and for 30 seconds neither of them said anything. And then he said, "Tom told you." It wasn't a question. "Tom told me?" she said. He looked at his plate. Then he looked at her, and his expression had the particular quality she'd come to associate with him when he was deciding how honest to be, that slight inward turn, that weighing. "I was going to tell you myself, this evening." "I know." She sat down across from him, which she didn't usually do, and the departure from routine caused him to recalibrate slightly. She could see it. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me the same way." "Go ahead," he said. "Does Deering actually have a legal angle here, or is he manufacturing one?" Harrison looked at her without evasion. "He's manufacturing one. The survey is legitimate. The deed is clean. My lawyer in Dust Creek is confident." A pause. "But Deering has a relationship with the Territorial Land Office in Helena that my lawyer doesn't have, and the judge in Dust Creek is fair, but he's also human and susceptible to pressure from Helena. And if Deering pushes hard enough through the right channels, he can make the survey dispute expensive and slow, even if he can't win it outright." "And using me," Emily said. "Adding a character argument. That helps him how?" "It doesn't help him in court necessarily. It helps him in the community." Harrison's jaw was steady, but she could see what it cost him to say it. Dust Creek and the surrounding ranches, those relationships matter to this operation. Suppliers. Help at Roundup. The social fabric of a territory is thin, and when it's damaged— He stopped. "When my presence damages it," Emily said. "I'm not saying that. I know you're not. I'm saying it." She kept her eyes on his. "Mr. Harrison, I am a single woman of no family living on your property. I am large, and I am not what people in this territory consider a natural candidate for respectable employment of this kind. I know exactly what the story looks like from the outside because I have spent 25 years being a person that stories are told about from the outside." She let that land. "The question I'm asking is whether my being here is going to cost you something real." He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was taking the question seriously, which she'd come to expect from him. "It might," he said finally. "I won't lie to you. Deering can stir up talk, and talk has weight out here." "Then I should consider whether to stay," she said. "That's your decision to make," he said, "not mine. You could make it easier by asking me to leave." Something moved through his expression, fast, but she caught it. "I'm not going to do that." "Why not?" He looked at her directly. "Because you came here on fair terms, and you've done nothing wrong. And I don't run my operation by letting men like Cal Deering dictate who I employ." He paused. "And because you made 12 men eat well for 5 days, and I watched Tom Briggs laugh at something yesterday for the first time in longer than I can remember, and those things have value that I'm not willing to dismiss because a greedy man found a convenient angle." Emily looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, with the honest, assessing attention she gave everything that mattered, and she did not find what she was looking for, which was the performance of it. It wasn't performed. He wasn't saying the right thing because he'd calculated that it was the right thing. He was saying it because it was what he actually thought, and the absence of performance in it was more persuasive than any performance could have been. "All right," she said. "All right, you're staying," he said. "All right, I'm staying," she said. "But I want to know if it gets worse. I don't want to be managed. I want to know." "You'll know," he said. She stood up. "Eat your food. It's going cold." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and the ma'am had something in it she didn't examine too closely. 3 days later, Cal Deering rode in himself. Emily was in the kitchen, and she heard the horses, and she heard the particular social shift that moved through the men working nearby, a tightening, a stillness, the group response to something unwelcome arriving. She looked through the window, and she saw him. Deering was maybe 50 built wide in the shoulders, with the particular solidity of a man who had turned physical confidence into social authority and used them as a single instrument. He had 2 men with him who had the specific function of being visibly larger than the situation required. He dismounted like a man who expected spaces to accommodate him. Harrison came out of the barn. They stood in the yard and talked. She couldn't hear it from the kitchen, but she could read the shapes of it. Harrison still and square. Deering, expansive and deliberate, the two large men positioned slightly back, but present enough to be part of the sentence. It lasted maybe 6 minutes. Then Harrison said something short. Deering's posture changed not much but enough. He glanced toward the house, toward specifically the kitchen window. He looked directly at Emily's face. She did not step back from the window. She stood where she was and looked back at him with the same direct attention she'd been told all her life was impolite for a woman of her position and had never managed to successfully unlearn. Deering looked away first. He said something else to Harrison. Harrison said something back. Then Deering turned and remounted, and his two men remounted, and they rode out, and the yard returned to itself. Harrison came into the kitchen 4 minutes later. "What did he say?" Emily said. "He offered to make the survey dispute go away." Harrison said, "If I let my cook go." The sentence was simple and complete, and she let it be what it was. "And you said?" "I told him my staffing decisions were mine to make, and his legal theories were his own problem." Harrison looked at her steadily. "I also told him that if he rode onto my property again with the intention of discussing my domestic arrangements, I'd consider it trespassing." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "He looked at me, through the window, deliberately." "I know, I saw. He wanted me to know that he'd identified me as the pressure point." "Yes." She turned back to the stove, turned down the heat on something that was running too hot, made the adjustment with the steady hands that had replaced the shaking and stayed that way. "He thinks if I'm uncomfortable enough, I'll leave and remove his problem for him. That's what he thinks," Harrison said. "He doesn't know me very well." "No," Harrison said. "He doesn't." She heard something in his voice when he said it, not pride exactly, but something that sat in the same neighborhood. Something that took her particular quality of stubbornness and received it as a specific good thing rather than a problem to be managed. She did not turn around. "I'm making a roast tonight," she said. "The men have been working hard." A pause. "That sounds good," Harrison said, and his voice was even and quiet and meant more than what the words said. He left the kitchen. Emily stood at the stove and let herself feel for exactly 1 moment the full weight of what had just happened. A man she'd known 2 weeks refusing to remove her in order to resolve a business threat, doing it calmly, without making a production of her gratitude, and then going back to work. She let herself feel what that was, because it was new enough that her body didn't have a category for it and needed the moment to build one. Then she turned down the heat on the roast and went back to work. The twist arrived on a Sunday in a letter. Tom brought it from the supply rider who came through twice a month, and he brought it directly to Emily without opening it, which she noted, and she saw the handwriting on the outside, and felt something drop through her chest. It was Hector Falk's handwriting. She opened it at the kitchen table, with Tom conspicuously finding something to do at the far end of the room. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first explained that a man named Ellis Crane, who was Deering's Helena lawyer, had visited the Broken Wheel Saloon and spoken with Hector about Emily's time in his employ. The second paragraph described what Hector had said. The third paragraph was Hector telling her he was sorry, which was the most surprising thing she had read in years, and also the most useless. What Hector had told Ellis Crane's lawyer, that Emily Carter was a reliable worker, but had a history of forming inappropriate attachments to male patrons, that he had let her go because of concerns about her conduct, and that her departure to a single man's remote ranch was consistent with a pattern of behavior he had observed over 4 years. Emily read it twice. She read it 3 times. She folded it very neatly along its original creases. Tom across the room was not actually doing anything. He was just existing in a way that gave her space, and she was grateful for that, in a way she couldn't have articulated. "Tom," she said. "Yeah. I need to speak with Mr. Harrison." He was there in less than 5 minutes, which told her Tom had moved faster than his bad knee usually allowed, which told her Tom had been worried. Harrison came in and looked at her face, and then sat down at the table across from her without being asked. She handed him the letter. He read it. He read it without his expression doing anything dramatic, which she appreciated, because she needed steady right now, and drama would have cost her the steadiness she was using both hands to hold. He set the letter on the table. "Hector Falk is a coward," he said. "He's afraid of a lawyer from Helena," she said. "Most people are. That doesn't excuse it." "No, it doesn't." She looked at the letter. "What it does is give Deering something he can put in front of a judge if he wants to argue character. Not yours. Mine." Harrison was quiet. "He's building a case that I'm here for reasons other than employment," she said. "And if my former employer is willing to say things that support that case." She stopped, breathed. "It changes your exposure, legally and socially. Emily." He used her given name, and she noted it filed. It kept going. "I'm not changing my position because of this." "I know you're not." She looked at him. "But I need to change mine." His expression sharpened. "Meaning?" "Meaning I need to think about whether there's something we can do that takes this angle away from him. Something formal. Something that changes what I am on this ranch in a way that the law and the community can see clearly." Harrison looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. The fire was burning low and she hadn't built it up, and the afternoon light was doing something specific through the window that she wasn't looking at. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" he said. "I'm suggesting we consider our options," she said. "Practically. Without—" She pushed down the thing that wanted to make this complicated. "Without any confusion about what I'm saying or why I'm saying it." "And what are you saying?" he said, quiet, even, those dark eyes on her face. Emily Carter, who had spent 25 years building a wall between herself and the thing she was currently standing on the edge of, looked at William Harrison across a kitchen table in the Montana mountains and said, "I'm saying that if you were to formalize this arrangement, it would remove Deering's argument entirely. And I'm saying that's a practical reason, and I'm not asking you to dress it up as anything else." Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if I wanted to dress it up as something else?" She stared at him. He didn't look away. He didn't soften it, or take it back, or fill the silence with something easier. He just sat there across from her, with his hands on the table, and his steady dark eyes, and waited with the patience that was his most consistent characteristic. "Mr. Harrison," she said, and her voice came out lower than she'd intended. "Will," he said. "I think we've earned first names." "Will." She said it carefully. "I have been at this ranch for 2 weeks." "I know." "I came here as an employee." "I know." "You don't know me." "I know more than you think," he said. "I know you got up before sunrise every day and made 12 men eat the best food they've had in years and didn't ask for thanks but noticed when it was given. I know you stood at that window when Deering looked at you and didn't step back." He paused. "I know you just handed me a letter that gave you every reason to protect yourself by leaving, and instead of leaving, you sat down and started thinking about how to protect me." The kitchen was very quiet. "That's not—" she started. "That's exactly what it was," he said gently. "And you can call it practical if that's easier. But I've been watching you for 2 weeks, and I know what it looks like when someone is practical, and I know what it looks like when someone cares, and those aren't always the same thing." Emily looked at the table. She looked at the letter sitting between them. She looked at her hands. She thought about May's voice saying, "You deserve someone who notices what you're worth without being asked." She thought about the wall she'd built and how much work it had taken, and how strange it was to be sitting on both sides of it simultaneously. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want that said plainly. I'm not looking for easy. I have opinions about my kitchen, and I don't yield them. I've noticed. I won't be managed or handled or made smaller to fit a space." "I'd have no idea how to make you smaller," he said, "and I wouldn't try." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time with the honest, direct, unflinching attention that had always made people uncomfortable, and he met it without flinching. "All right," she said finally. His breath shifted, just slightly. "All right," he said. "But we do this right," she said. I won't have it be a transaction. If we do this, we do it in town with a judge proper and legal and witnessed." "Yes," he said, "and you never use it to override my kitchen." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. "Understood. Or my days off. Both of them. Both of them." "Done," he said. She looked at him for one more moment. This man she had known for 3 weeks who had walked into a saloon kitchen to say thank you, and somehow by that single act started the unraveling of everything she had decided about what her life was going to be. She picked up the letter and stood. "I'll need to send a response to May," she said. "She'll want to know I'm all right. Tom can get a message to the supply writer." "Good." She turned to the stove. "Supper in 2 hours." "Emily," he said. She stopped, turned slightly. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She looked at him over her shoulder. 25 years of learning not to want things. 2 weeks on a mountain. A letter from a coward, and a man who hadn't moved when he should have stepped back. "Don't make me regret it," she said. And for the first time in front of her fully and completely, and without anything restrained about it, William Harrison smiled. She turned back to the stove before it could do to her what it was clearly trying to do, and she built the fire up and set about making supper, and the kitchen filled with warmth and smell and the particular density of a room where something real had just happened. And she let herself feel the edges of it without looking at it directly, the way you look at something, bright sideways carefully, so it doesn't blind you before you're ready. They rode into Dust Creek on a Wednesday morning 11 days after the letter arrived. Emily had spent those 11 days doing what she always did when something large was pressing on her from the inside. She worked. She reorganized the larder and built an inventory system that Tom called unnecessary, and then used religiously within 48 hours. She developed a bread schedule that meant fresh loaves hit the table every morning without requiring her to start before 4. She sourced 3 new spices from the supply rider and experimented with the roast until she had it exactly where she wanted it, and the men ate it on the 9th day with the specific silence that meant she'd gotten it right. She did not talk about what was coming. Harrison did not bring it up. They had said what needed saying in the kitchen that afternoon, and neither of them was the kind of person who needed to revisit a decision once it was made. What they were, she was slowly discovering, was 2 people who operated on the same frequency, without having planned to, both of them preferring action to discussion. Both of them more comfortable in the doing of a thing than in the talking around it. What she did do on the 3rd night after their conversation was write a letter to May. She wrote it twice. The first version was too careful, too constructed, too much the voice she used when she was managing someone else's reaction to her news. She threw it in the fire and wrote the second version the way she would have talked to May if May had been sitting across the table, directly, honestly, without the protective layer. "May, I'm well. The kitchen is mine and the work is real and the men are decent. Something has happened that I'm still making sense of, but that I believe is good, and I will tell you more when there is more to tell. I am not lonely. I was not sure I would be able to say that. E." She sent it with the supply rider. She did not wait for a response before she stopped feeling the weight of having sent it, which she recognized as progress of a particular kind. The morning they rode to town, she dressed in the best dress she owned, which was not saying much, but was saying something, and she pinned her hair with more attention than usual, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin with the honest assessment she applied to everything. She looked like herself. That was all. She had never looked like what the world thought a bride should look like, and she was not going to look like that today, and she had made a separate peace with that fact somewhere around age 16, and the peace had held reasonably well ever since. She was a large woman with a beautiful face and capable hands, and she was riding into Dust Creek to marry a man who had seen all of that and made an informed decision, and the mirror could hold whatever opinion it wanted. She went out to the horses. Harrison was already mounted. He looked at her when she came out, and something moved through his expression, quick, genuine, unperformed, that she filed in the growing collection of things about him she was learning to trust. "Ready," he said. "Let's go," she said. The ride was 4 hours, and they made it in 3.5 because the morning was cool enough to push the pace without distressing the horses, and because neither of them was inclined toward delay once a direction had been chosen. They talked more on that ride than they had in the previous 3 weeks combined. It started. Simply, she asked about the North Pasture dispute, the specific legal timeline, what his Dust Creek lawyer had actually said about their exposure. He answered with the same directness she'd asked, with which she appreciated more than she knew how to say. The dispute was real, but beatable. Deering's Helena lawyer was good, but not infallible. The survey evidence was clean. The character argument, however, had legs, if it was allowed to develop, and removing it preemptively was the right move legally, which was why they were riding to Dust Creek this morning. She knew that was why. She had told him it was why. She held on to that framing because it was clean and manageable, and didn't require her to look at the other reasons, the ones that lived underneath the practical ones, and had been getting louder for 11 days. "Tell me about your wife," she said somewhere around the second hour. She felt him shift slightly in the saddle beside her. It wasn't retreat, he didn't pull away from the question. It was more the adjustment of a person reaching toward something they'd kept at a careful distance. "Elsie," he said. Her name in his mouth was simple and complete, the way you say the name of someone you have fully grieved. She was from Ohio, came out with her family in '74. She was the kind of person who made a room better by being in it without knowing that was what she was doing. Emily listened. She died in the 3rd year. Fever. It was fast at the end, but the before part wasn't fast. He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 2 years after that being angry at things that didn't deserve it. The land, the weather, men who'd done nothing wrong. I wasn't good company, and I knew it, and I didn't much care. And then I ran out of angry," he said. "That's the only way I know to put it. I just ran out. And what was underneath it was just quiet. The particular quiet of a house that was built for more people than are in it." Emily thought about her room behind the kitchen at the Broken Wheel. The particular quality of quiet she'd become so familiar with that she'd stopped identifying it as loneliness and started calling it normal. "I understand that quiet," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I know you do," he said. They rode without talking for a while after that, and the silence was not empty. Around the 3rd hour, he said, "What made you decide to leave the saloon? Really, not the wage." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "May said something to me," she said finally. "The morning I left. She said don't come back unless you want to, not because it's familiar, not because it's safe." A pause. I'd been confusing familiar with safe for 4 years. She named it, and I couldn't unknow it after that. Harrison was quiet. "What you said," she continued, "in the saloon, when you came back to the kitchen, about thanking whoever made the bread." She kept her eyes on the trail. "I'd been cooking in that kitchen for 4 years, and no one had ever come back to say that. Not once." She let that be what it was for a moment. "It didn't make me feel romantic about you. It made me feel angry." He turned to look at her. Angry. At myself. For how much it meant. That one person came back to say thank you, and it meant that much told me something I didn't want to know about what I'd been accepting. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm glad it made you angry." She looked at him. "Anger got you on the horse," he said simply. She thought about that for the rest of the ride. Yeah, Dust Creek looked exactly the same. She had been gone less than a month, and the town had not marked her absence in any visible way, which was accurate and expected and still landed somewhere specific in her chest. They rode in on the main road, and she was aware of being seen of the particular phenomenon of being Emily Carter, who had lived in this town for 25 years and cooked in its saloon for 4, riding in beside William Harrison, which was the kind of arrival that Dust Creek's social metabolism would process as information within the hour. She sat straight in her saddle. She looked at the town the same way she'd looked at Deering through the kitchen window, directly, without apology, without the slight diminishment she'd spent years using to make herself easier for other people to be comfortable around. They tied the horses outside the judge's office. Judge Caleb Farrow was 60-something sparse, with the specific judicial temperament of a man who had seen enough human complexity that very little surprised him anymore. He looked at Harrison. He looked at Emily. He looked at the two of them together with the assessing attention of someone reading a room. "Will," he said by way of greeting. "Caleb, we need a few minutes of your time." Farrow opened the door wider. They went in. 20 minutes later, they came out. It was that simple, and that enormous, and that anticlimactic. All at once, a thing said in front of a witness. A document signed a handshake between Harrison and Farrow, and a nod from Farrow to Emily that contained, she thought, a quiet species of respect she hadn't been expecting. She was standing in the main road of Dust Creek, with the sun coming down, and the dust moving, and the sounds of the town going on around her exactly as it always had. And something had changed in the world, and the world didn't know yet, and she did. "You all right?" Harrison said beside her. "Yes," she said. "You went somewhere. I came back." She looked at him. William Harrison. Her husband, which was a word that currently had no traction in her mind. She would need time to wear it in the way you wear in new boots until it sat right. "I want to go see May." He nodded. "I'll see to the horses and meet you there." She walked to the Broken Wheel. The Broken Wheel saloon was exactly as she'd left it. The particular smell of wood and tobacco and spilled beer that she'd spent 4 years breathing without fully registering, the way you stop registering the smell of your own life. She pushed through the door, and the noon light came in behind her, and May, who was carrying 2 plates toward the back tables, looked up and stopped. She set the plates down on the nearest table without looking at them. "M," she said. Emily walked toward her, and May closed the distance, and they met in the middle of the room, and Emily let herself be held briefly and completely, the way she'd let herself be held when she left, and then stepped back. "You look different," May said, studying her face. "Same face. Different woman in it." May tilted her head. "What happened?" "A lot," Emily said. "We got married this morning." May's mouth opened, closed. "You and Harrison." "Me and Harrison." Emily Rose Carter. Emily Rose Harrison as of about 40 minutes ago. May made a sound that was not fully a word, and pulled her in again. And this time, Emily didn't step back as fast, and May was laughing against her shoulder, and Emily found to her own surprise that she was too. The short, genuine, slightly overwhelmed laugh of someone who has done an enormous thing and is only now beginning to feel the size of it. When May pulled back, her eyes were wet. "Are you happy?" Emily looked at her. The honest answer, the one she'd been building toward since a man walked into a kitchen and looked at her hands, was more complicated than a simple yes, and also simpler than anything she'd been able to say about herself in a long time. "I think I'm getting there," she said. May nodded like that was exactly right. That was when Hector Falk came out of his back office. He saw Emily and stopped. He looked older than a month should have made him. He looked like a man who had written a letter he regretted and had been living with the weight of it. The saloon was quiet in the way spaces go quiet when they sense something is about to be said. Hector looked at her. "Emily." "Hector," she said. "I heard you were back in town." A pause. "I heard about Harrison." He shifted his weight. "I need to say something. I got your letter. I know. What I told that lawyer." He stopped. "It wasn't true, what I said about your conduct here. I want you to know, I know that." Emily looked at him. She had rehearsed this in the small hours of several mornings, what she would say if she were ever standing in this room saying it. She had rehearsed versions that were satisfying and sharp, and left him with the specific understanding of what he'd done and what it had cost. She had all of those ready. What she said instead was, "Why did you say it, Hector?" He looked at the floor. The lawyer was persistent. "And I panicked. I'm not proud of it." "No," she said. "You shouldn't be." I'm sorry, Emily. She looked at him for a long moment. Hector Falk, who had employed her out of his own advantage and housed her because it suited him, and who had thrown her under the wheels of a Helena lawyer, because he'd panicked and chosen the easy thing. He was not a villain. He was something smaller and more ordinary, and in some ways harder to resolve because villains you could hate cleanly, and Hector didn't deserve clean hatred, just a very clear accounting. Your apology is noted, she said. I accept it for what it's worth. He looked up. Which isn't everything, she said, but it's something. He nodded, swallowed. Will Harrison's a good man, he said. I know that, she said. You didn't give me credit for knowing it, which was its own problem. But yes, he is. Hector had nothing left to say to that, and she didn't give him room to find something, because she wasn't here for his redemption. She was here for May, and she'd said what she'd come to say to Hector, and the rest of the space in the Broken Wheel Saloon was not hers to fill. She turned back to May, and Harrison came through the door behind her, and May looked at him, and then at Emily, and the expression on May's face was the expression of someone who is genuinely glad to see two specific things occupying the same space. Harrison touched his hat brim to May. Ma'am. May said, You'd better take care of her. I intend to, he said. She'll tell you when you're getting it wrong. She has, he said, and I expect she'll continue to. May looked at Emily with something bright in her eyes. I like him, she said. I know, Emily said. Don't tell him too fast. They were about to leave when Deering walked in. Emily felt it before she saw it, that shift in the room's atmosphere. She'd learned to read that collective pulling back of the social temperature. She turned, and there he was, Cal Deering, who had not expected to find her here, and whose face in the first unguarded second showed that plainly. He recovered quickly. Men like Deering always recovered quickly. It was one of their primary skills. Harrison, he said. His eyes moved to Emily with the specific measurement of someone recalculating a problem. Miss Carter. Mrs. Harrison, Emily said. The two words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. She felt them ripple out. She felt the specific recalibration they caused in Deering's expression, something that moved behind his eyes fast, that she identified as the recognition of a door closing. Is that so? Deering said. It is, Harrison said. He was standing just slightly forward of Emily, not in front of her, not blocking her beside her in the way of a man who is signaling something without needing to announce it. Judge Farrow performed the ceremony about an hour ago. You're welcome to confirm it. Deering looked at them both. He looked at the room around him, which was paying close attention because Dust Creek ran on this kind of information, and everyone present understood what they were witnessing. My congratulations, he said, and the word was empty as a dry well. Thank you, Emily said. He looked at her. The direct measuring look she'd received through the kitchen window at the ranch, the look that was meant to categorize her as a problem. She received it the same way she'd received it then, standing where she was, not diminishing, not looking away. I hope, Deering said slowly, that Will's aware of what he's taken on. The room went very quiet. Emily felt Harrison go still beside her with the specific stillness that precedes motion, and she did something she wouldn't have done a month ago. She put her hand on his arm. Light, just contact, just the specific communication of, I have this. She looked at Deering and she said, He knows exactly what he's taken on. The question you should be asking is whether you know what you've taken on. Deering's eyes narrowed slightly. You've spent 6 months trying to take 200 acres from a man who earned them, she said. And when that didn't work fast enough, you tried using me as a pressure point. I want you to understand something clearly. She held his gaze with the steadiness she'd built from years of standing in rooms where people didn't think she mattered. I am not a pressure point. I am not a vulnerability. And the arrangement you were trying to exploit does not exist anymore, which means your angle does not exist anymore, which means all you have left is a bad survey argument and a Helena lawyer who's been billing you for 6 months. She paused. I hope it was worth it. The silence in the Broken Wheel Saloon lasted long enough to have a shape. Deering looked at her. He looked at Harrison. He looked at the room around him, which was watching with the particular attention of a community storing information that would be discussed for years. He left without saying anything else. The door closed behind him and the room let out a collective breath, and then from somewhere near the back, old Gerald Watkins, who was at his usual table having his usual noon meal, said, "Well done, young lady." And the room agreed in the specific way rooms agree when they've witnessed something true. Emily turned to Harrison. His expression was, she didn't have a word for it yet, but she thought. She was building the vocabulary for his face, the way she built everything carefully, honestly, piece by piece. "You didn't need me to say anything," she said. "No," he said. "But I was glad you were there." May appeared at Emily's elbow. "I need you to know," May said, "that I am going to tell that story for the rest of my life." "Tell it accurately," Emily said. "I will make it better," May said firmly. "Cowboy." The twist came an hour later when they were almost ready to ride back. Emily was outside with the horses while Harrison settled something at the supply merchant, and she was checking the mare's girth and thinking about what she needed to add to the provisions order when she heard her name. She turned. The woman was maybe 45, well-dressed in the particular restrained way of someone who had money and the taste not to announce it loudly. Dark hair going silver at the temples. Eyes that were assessing in a way Emily recognized, not hostile, but measuring the look of someone deciding whether something is what it appears to be. "You're Emily Carter," the woman said. "Harrison's wife as of today." "That's right," Emily said. "I'm Margaret Deering," the woman said. "Cal's wife." Emily went very still. Margaret Deering looked at her with an expression that was complicated in ways Emily needed a moment to map. "I know what my husband has been doing," she said. "I want you to know that. The survey dispute, the other things." Something moved through her face. "I don't condone it. I can't stop it, but I don't condone it." Emily looked at her carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're going to need to know who your enemies are and who they aren't," Margaret Deering said. "Cal is your enemy. I am not." A pause. "And because what you said to him in there." She glanced toward the saloon. "I've wanted someone to say that to him for a long time." Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at Margaret Deering, a woman who lived with a difficult man and carried the weight of his choices, and had come out here to say something true at some cost to herself. "Does he know you're speaking to me?" Emily said. "No." "And when he finds out?" Margaret Deering's expression was steady. "I'll manage that the way I manage everything. Quietly, and from the inside." She met Emily's eyes. "The survey dispute has a witness document that Cal's lawyer doesn't know about. My father surveyed this territory in '68 and kept records that weren't filed publicly. I know where they are." Emily's chest tightened. "Those records would settle the pasture dispute." "Yes." "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret Deering was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that has a history in it. "Because I have spent 20 years watching my husband take things from people who worked for what they had," she said finally. "And I am tired of it. And you walked into that saloon today and said the thing I've been thinking for 20 years, and you said it to his face and didn't flinch." She paused. "That deserves something." Emily looked at her. She looked at her for a long time, with the honest, direct attention she gave everything important. And she found in Margaret Deering's face something she recognized, a woman who had lived inside a version of invisible for a very long time and had built an entire life out of the spaces no one was watching. "Thank you," Emily said. "Tell me about these records." Margaret Deering told her. By the time Harrison came out of the merchant, Emily was standing by the horses with a location, a description and a plan that had taken 10 minutes to build, but had the potential to end a 6-month legal dispute before it cost another $1. He looked at her face. "What happened?" "I'll tell you on the ride back," she said. "It's a long story, and it's good news, and I need you to be moving when I tell it, because I don't want to see your face do what it's going to do when I tell it." He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost a smile. "You can't just tell me now." I can absolutely not tell you now, she said. Mount up, Will. He mounted. They rode out of Dust Creek and she felt the town at her back as they went. Hector's apology, May's tears, Deering's retreating back, Margaret, Deering's steady eyes, Judge Farrow's nod, Gerald Watkins's voice from the back of the room. All of it at her back and ahead of her. The mountains and a kitchen that felt like it was hers, and 12 men who had started calling her Miss Emily sometime in the second week without her asking them to. She waited until they were clear of the main road. Cal Deering's wife found me by the horses, she said. Harrison looked at her sharply. Her name is Margaret. Her father was a surveyor in '68, and he kept records that weren't publicly filed. She met his eyes. Records that document the north pasture boundary exactly as your survey shows it, which would mean Deering's claim has no legal ground at all, not just weak ground. Harrison had stopped his horse. She stopped hers beside him. Where are these records? He said. In a ledger box in the back of the Dust Creek Land Registry office, she said. Filed under her father's name, which is Calloway. She says no one has looked at it in 15 years because no one knew it was there. Harrison was looking at her with an expression she was still building the vocabulary for, but which she was fairly certain contained several things at once. Why did she tell you? He said. Because I said something to her husband in front of witnesses, Emily said, and she's been wanting someone to say it for 20 years. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, We need to go back to Dust Creek. We do, she said. Today. Before the registry office closes, she said, which is in 2 hours, so we should move. He looked at her, that look she was still learning. Emily. Will. You've been here less than a month, he said with something in his voice that wasn't quite disbelief and wasn't quite awe and was something that sat between them. The food's been good though, she said. He made a sound that was definitely a laugh, short and real, and surprised out of him, and she filed it carefully in the collection of things she was keeping, and they turned their horses back toward Dust Creek and rode. They found the ledger box exactly where Margaret Deering said it would be. The clerk at the registry office, a young man named Peters, who was approximately 22, and deeply unprepared for the specific energy of the two people who walked through his door. 1 hour before closing, looked at the box Harrison set on his counter with the expression of someone encountering a problem he hadn't been trained for. I need this documented and witnessed, Harrison said. Today. Sir. The formal process requires Peters, Emily said, and something in the way she said it made the young man look at her with the full attention people usually reserve for more impressive-looking people. We need this documented today because there is an ongoing legal dispute in which this evidence is material, and every day it stays undocumented is another day the wrong person has an advantage they didn't earn. She held his gaze. What do you need to do this correctly, and right now? Peters looked at the box. He looked at the document Harrison had laid beside it, the original survey. He looked at Emily. I need a second witness, he said, and a fee of $2. Get your witness, Harrison said. I have the $2. Peters got his witness, an older man from the adjacent office who looked at the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood what he was looking at, and they processed it. It took 45 minutes. Peters, Emily noticed, was surprisingly competent once he had been pointed in the right direction, and she filed that away as useful information for the future. When they walked out of the registry office, the sun was low, and the day had been the longest she could remember in years, and she was tired in a way that went bone deep. Harrison stopped on the steps. Cal Deering's lawyer is going to receive a copy of that documentation tomorrow, he said, through my lawyer. I know. The dispute is essentially over. I know. He looked at her. You did that. Margaret Deering did that, Emily said. I was just standing by the horses. You said the thing that made her want to help. I said the thing I should have said, she said. Which is different. He looked at her for a long moment in the fading light of a day that had started with a 4-hour ride in a courthouse and ended with a land dispute dismantled and a ledger box that had been waiting 15 years for someone to open it. Are you ready to go home? he said. The word arrived and settled, and she let it be what it was. Home. 4 weeks ago, home was a room behind a kitchen she didn't own in a saloon where nobody learned her name. Today, it was a ranch 40 miles north with a kitchen that ran hot on the left side of the stove, and 12 men who called her Miss Emily, and a man on horseback beside her who asked if she was ready to go home, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Yes, she said. I'm ready. They rode north as the sky turned colors she didn't have words for, and she was tired, and she was not lonely, and somewhere around the second hour, she let herself look at the thing she'd been approaching sideways since a man walked into a kitchen to say thank you. And what she found when she looked at it directly was not as frightening as she'd expected. It felt instead like exactly what it was. Something beginning. Part 1. Lưu ý viết 4.500 đến 5.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc chân thực và gần gũi, không mô tả cảnh, tập trung vào hành động, cảm xúc và tâm lý nhân vật. Viết phần 4 đất điểm 10 trên 10 và bổ sung tiết tấu câu chuyện nhanh, sửa lời AI, kể theo ngôi thứ 3, tăng độ kịch tính, không viết lân man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang mực document mới, 2 đến 3 phút cần có mini climax và đặt 10 đến 15. Mini climax mọi phần cứ 10 đến 12 phút, có một twist lớn sâu sắc đan xen mini cliffhanger mạnh hơn, tăng tính tự nhiên cho phản ứng của các nhân vật, thêm nhịp điệu kịch tính thực tế và gần gũi. Mỗi 8 đến 10 phút cần có móc giữ chân khán giả. Lưu ý không mô tả cảnh và chỉ cần viết nội dung và viết đúng lệnh nhé. Show more. The letter from Deering's lawyer arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after they filed the Callaway survey documents with Peters at the registry office. Harrison read it at the breakfast table. Emily watched him read it from the stove, where she was pulling the morning bread, and she had learned enough about his face by now to read the letter's content in his expression before he said a word. The jaw that settled when something was resolved. The specific release around his eyes that he didn't know he did when a thing that had been pressing on him stopped pressing. He set the letter down. Deering's dropping the survey claim, he said. The kitchen went quiet. Tom, who was at the table with his coffee, set down the cup. 2 of the ranch hands who'd come in early looked at each other. All of it, Tom said. All of it. Harrison looked at Emily. His lawyer cited new documentary evidence that materially contradicts the basis of the claim, which is the legal way of saying they looked at the Callaway survey and understood what it meant. Emily set the bread pan on the rack. She picked up a cloth and wiped her hands, and she let herself feel for one full moment the specific satisfaction of a thing concluded properly. Not triumphant, just right. The way a joint fits when it's been measured correctly. Good, she said. Tom made a sound that was mostly exhale. 6 months, he said. 6 months of that man's lawyers and writers and his business at the land office, and it ends because Will's wife was standing next to the right horses at the right time. Margaret Deering made that happen, Emily said. You made Margaret Deering want to, Tom said, and his tone carried the particular firmness of a man who had decided something was true and was not interested in argument. Emily turned back to the bread. She heard Harrison push back his chair and cross the kitchen, and she was aware of him stopping just behind her, close enough to be present, far enough to be considerate. And she turned. He was looking at her with that expression she'd been building vocabulary for since the courthouse steps. She had more words for it now. Gratitude was in there, but underneath the gratitude was something older and less comfortable for him to carry, the particular look of a man who has been solitary long enough that someone being genuinely useful to him, genuinely on his side, had become something he didn't fully know how to receive. Thank you, he said. She looked at him directly. You don't need to thank me. It's my ranch too now. Something shifted in his face. Fast, but she caught it. The word ranch, said that way, possessive, settled without qualification, had done something to him that she hadn't anticipated, and that she filed away carefully to think about later. "Yes," he said. "It is." She handed him a piece of bread. "Eat. You have fencing to check on the north line." He took the bread, and the corner of his mouth moved, and he went back to the table, and the kitchen resumed around her, and Emily stood at the stove and let the morning be what it was. The first hard thing happened 6 days after the letter. She had been at the ranch for 5 weeks, and she had learned its rhythms the way she learned everything, by paying close attention and making adjustments based on what she found. She knew which mornings the men came in tired because they'd been up with a sick animal and needed coffee before anything else. She knew Tom's knee was worse on cold mornings, and that he would never say so, and that having something warm on the table early was a kindness he received without acknowledging. She knew Harrison took his coffee black and didn't eat much at noon, but needed a real supper, and that the evenings when he came in later than usual were the evenings when something on the ranch had gone wrong, and he was carrying it quietly in the way he carried everything. What she hadn't yet learned was how to navigate the specific new territory of being married to a man she was still, in most of the ways that mattered, getting to know. They had been practical about it. The marriage was real and legal, and they had both entered it with clear eyes, but the daily reality of it was something they were building in real time, and some days the construction went smoothly, and some days it hit a wall neither of them had expected. The wall arrived on a Tuesday evening. Harrison came in late. She'd kept supper warm, and she didn't ask where he'd been, because he was a grown man who ran a ranch, and he didn't owe her an accounting of his hours. He sat down and ate, and she cleaned the kitchen around him, and the quiet between them was the normal quiet of two people who worked hard and were tired at the end of a day. Then he said, "I rode out to the north pasture." She waited. "There's a section of fence along the Cowboy line that needs rebuilding. Full rebuild, not a repair. It'll take the better part of 2 weeks with the crew I can spare." He looked at his plate. "It's going to pull 3 men off the south work, and we'll fall behind on the summer mending." "What do you need?" she said. "I need another pair of experienced hands for 2 weeks." He paused. "I was thinking about hiring temporary. There are men in Dust Creek who do seasonal work." "Do it," she said. "It'll cost more than I budgeted for July." "Will." She turned from the work table to face him. "Do you need me to approve your labor decisions?" He looked up. "No." "Then why are you telling me about the budget like it's a problem?" He held her gaze. "Because it affects the household accounts. And we haven't talked about how those work." Oh, she thought. That was the wall. They had married in practical urgency and covered the territory. That urgency required the legal structure, the land dispute, the daily mechanics of the ranch, and they had not covered this. The question of what she was exactly in the financial architecture of the Harrison Ranch. Cook-wife-woman who had opinions about the kitchen budget but had not been formally included in the larger conversation about money. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "Tell me," she said. He did. He was direct about it in the way he was direct about everything. The ranch's income, which was solid but not luxurious. The accounts he kept with the Dust Creek Bank. The budget he'd been running on, where it was tight, where it had flexibility. He laid it out without decoration, and she listened without interrupting. And at the end of it she said, "I had wages coming to me from the broken wheel that I never spent because there was nothing to spend them on. I have money in the Dust Creek Bank under my name." He looked at her. "I didn't know that." $73, she said. 4 years of saving when your only expenses are a room behind a kitchen. She held his gaze. "I'm not bringing it into a general account where it disappears. I want my own line in the books. What's mine is mine, and what's ours is ours, and those need to be separate, but visible." He didn't hesitate. "That's fair. I'll also need to be part of the supply budget going forward. I've been ordering provisions on informal credit through Tom, and it needs to be formalized. I know what I spend and why, and I can account for every cent." "I don't doubt it," he said. "You shouldn't." She looked at him. "I'm not going to run your household, Will. I'm going to run our household. That's different, and I need to know you understand the difference." He was quiet for a moment. Not resistant, she'd learned his quiet by now, and knew the difference between the quiet of a man deciding to push back and the quiet of a man sitting with something and letting it be real. "I understand the difference," he said. "Good." She stood up. "Hire your fence workers. I'll add the cost to the July account and we'll adjust the fall provisions budget to compensate." "You already know where to compensate." "I already know where to compensate." He looked at her with that expression again. "How long did it take you to understand this ranch's budget?" "About 2 weeks," she said. "I pay attention." "I've noticed," he said, and the way he said it was the way he said a lot of things, even understated, carrying more than the words. She went back to the work table. He finished his supper. The kitchen settled back into its evening quiet, and she felt the wall behind them, and what was on the other side of it, which was not a crisis, but a conversation they'd needed to have and had now had, and which had left things clearer. That was how it went, she was learning. Not dramatically, not with long speeches or moments of crystalline emotional revelation. Just two people working out the specific architecture of a shared life piece by piece, and finding that the pieces fit well enough to build on. The second hard thing was smaller and hit harder the way the small things always did. It was a Saturday 3 weeks after the Deering letter. The fence work was done, and the crew was back to normal rhythm, and the ranch had settled into the particular productive quiet of a place where the work was going well and nobody had a crisis. Emily had made a pie, something she did rarely, because pie was time-consuming, and her time was not without limits, but she'd found a cache of late summer berries that Tom had brought back from a supply run, and they had demanded to be used. She brought the pie out at supper and set it on the table, and the response from the crew was the response she'd come to expect, the specific speechless appreciation of men who had been eating well for weeks and still hadn't gotten used to it. One of the younger hands, a boy called Danny, who was maybe 19, and had the open face of someone who hadn't yet learned to keep his expressions to himself, said, "Miss Emily, I don't know how you do it." "I know what I'm doing," she said simply. "My mama couldn't cook like this," Danny said. "And she was a good cook." "Thank her anyway," Emily said. "Good cooks deserve thanks." Danny grinned. "She'd like you." Something landed quietly in Emily's chest. She kept her face even and passed the pie and let the supper continue, and didn't examine it right then, because the middle of a meal wasn't the place. Later, after the table was cleared and the kitchen was clean and the ranch was settling into its nighttime sounds, she was at the work table writing out the next week's provision list when Harrison came in and got himself a cup of water and stood for a moment without sitting down, which was his way of indicating he had something to say, but wasn't sure whether to say it. She had learned that tell in the first 2 weeks. "Say it," she said without looking up. He sat down. "That thing Danny said. About his mama. Did that bother you?" She kept writing for a moment, finished the line she was on, set down the pencil. "No," she said. "It didn't bother me." "You went somewhere after he said it." She looked at him. "You see too much sometimes." "Maybe," he said, not apologizing for it. She was quiet for a moment. What she'd felt at the table when Danny said she'd like you was not something she'd identified clearly until right now, which was that she had never in her adult life been the kind of woman that other women's mothers liked. She had been tolerated and employed and occasionally pitied, but she had not been the kind of woman that got brought home, shown off, spoken about with warmth. And the casualness with which Danny had said it, the simple assumption that his mother would like her just because she was likable, because that was an obvious thing, had done something to her that she wasn't fully ready to look at. "I spent a long time," she said slowly, "being invisible to the kind of people who decide who matters. Mothers, wives, women with standing in a community." She looked at her provision list. "Danny just assumed his mother would like me. It surprised me, that's all." Harrison looked at her for a long moment. "You matter," he said. "In this house and on this land. That's real. And it's been real since you got here." "I know," she said. "I'm learning to know it." She picked up the pencil. "That's different from just knowing it." He was quiet. Then he said carefully, "Elsie, my wife. She had trouble with that too, knowing things and learning to know them." Emily went still. He almost never spoke about Elsie. Not because he was hiding her. The way he'd said her name on the ride to Dust Creek had told Emily clearly that the grief for her was clean and finished and properly mourned. It was more that he was a man who understood that the present and the past needed separate rooms, and he didn't drag the past into rooms where it didn't belong. The fact that he was saying her name now in this kitchen, in this conversation about Emily's own difficulty, that was deliberate. She knew it was deliberate because he didn't do things accidentally. She turned to look at him. She was from Ohio, he said. Different world from out here. She knew she was a good person. She believed it the way you believe something you were told in church as a principle. But believing it and letting it be true, moment by moment, letting herself take up the space she'd earned. He paused. That took her longer, and she was better at it by the end than she'd been at the beginning. Emily held his gaze. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because she figured it out," he said, "and I want you to know that people figure it out." She looked at him for a long moment, with the honest attention she gave everything important. He was not comparing her to a dead woman. He was not trying to make her a replacement or a continuation or a consolation. He was doing what he always did, taking something true from one part of his life and offering it carefully to a different part because it was useful and because he thought she deserved to have it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He finished his water. He stood up. "The provision list," he said, looking at her paper. "You're adding smoked paprika. I've been wanting it for 3 weeks. The supply rider carries it. It's expensive." "It's worth it," she said. He looked at the list, then at her. "Put it in," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I already did," she said. He went out. She sat at the table and finished the list and let herself feel carefully the specific quality of an evening where something hard had been said and survived and left things better than before. She was beginning to understand that this was what a working marriage actually was, not the romantic architecture she'd been taught to want and had given up on wanting, but something more durable and, in its own way, more remarkable. Two people encountering each other's difficult edges without retreating and finding something that held anyway. The twist she didn't see coming arrived with May's letter 3 weeks later. She'd been at the ranch for 2 months by then, and the ranch had changed in the ways that places change when someone is paying full attention to them. The kitchen was running on her system now. Provisions tracked waste minimal, the men eating better than most ranch crews in the territory by Tom's accounting, which she accepted as probably accurate since Tom had been in the territory for 40 years and had a reliable sense of these things. She and Harrison had found their daily rhythm. Not effortless, there were still the walls, the moments when two solitary people with strong habits encountered each other's corners unexpectedly. But the walls were navigable now. They'd proven that enough times that she trusted it. May's letter arrived on a Friday with the regular supply rider. Emily read it at the kitchen table while Tom pretended to inventory the larder. The first paragraph was May, which meant it moved fast and covered a lot of ground in very few sentences. The second paragraph stopped her. Hector sold the broken wheel. Sold it to a man named Grover Finch from Billings who arrived last week and has already let 3 people go. I am one of the 3. I don't say this to worry you. I say this because I need to tell someone, and you are the person I tell things to. Emily read the paragraph 3 more times. Then she looked at Tom. How many bedrooms are in the main house? Tom turned from the larder with the expression of a man who had been listening and was not going to pretend otherwise. 4. Will uses 1, you use 1 storage, and 1's been empty since the Petersons stayed here in 79. Emily folded the letter, unfolded it, read May's words again. You are the person I tell things to. Tom, she said. Is there work for a woman here who isn't afraid of hard labor and has been working in service for 10 years and is the most efficient person I've ever seen move through a room? Tom was very still. What kind of work are you thinking? The household, Emily said. Not the kitchen that's mine, but the house itself. The cleaning, the mending, the things I don't have time for because I'm in the kitchen, and neither do you because you're running operations, and the men because they're doing ranch work. She looked at him. This house is getting bigger. The work it takes is getting bigger. Harrison needs help he hasn't hired because he doesn't like asking for things. That's accurate, Tom said. May needs work and a place, and she is exactly the person for this. Tom looked at her for a long moment. You'd need to ask Will. I know I'd need to ask Will, she said. I'm asking you first because you've known him longer than I have, and I want to know how to ask him. Tom made a sound that was mostly surprised laugh. Just ask him, he said. He doesn't like people going around things. Ask him straight. She asked him straight that evening. She told him about May quickly, accurately, without embellishment, the same way she'd have presented a provision problem. A skilled woman suddenly without employment, who had been Emily's closest person for 3 years. A house that needed more attention than it was getting. A bedroom sitting empty. Harrison listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What does she need?" "Wages, room meals, and to be treated like a person with a job and not like charity," Emily said. "She won't accept charity. She'd leave before she accepted it." "Sounds familiar," he said, and she heard the very specific way he said it and kept her face where it was. "Will you write to her?" "You write to her," he said. "It should come from you. Tell her the terms are fair and there's a room and work that needs doing." He paused. "Tell her she's welcome." Emily looked at him. "You don't know her." "You trust her," he said. "That's enough." She wrote the letter that night at the kitchen table, and it was the first version, and she didn't throw it in the fire, which meant she got it right on the first try, which happened when she knew exactly what she wanted to say. May. Come. There is work, and a room, and wages, and I need you here. Come as soon as you can arrange it. Emily Harrison. She sent it the next morning. May arrived on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks later on the supply wagon, because she'd timed her departure to coincide with the regular run, which was so specifically May, that Emily felt something come loose in her chest when she saw the wagon come in and the familiar figure on the bench beside the driver. She didn't run. She walked out to meet her. May climbed down from the wagon, and they looked at each other for a moment in the way of two people whose relationship has been real enough that seeing each other again doesn't require a lot of words to reestablish. "You look well," May said. "You look tired," Emily said. "Was the wagon terrible?" "The wagon was terrible," May confirmed, "but I've had worse." She looked around the ranch, the house, the outbuildings, the men who had stopped what they were doing to assess the new arrival. "This is real. What did you think it was going to be?" "I didn't know," May said honestly. "You wrote me, you were happy, but I needed to see it." And May looked at Emily's face. She looked at it for a long moment with the attention of a woman who had been paying close attention to Emily Carter for 3 years. "You're different," she said. "Same person. Different weight to you, not heavier." May searched for it. "More solid, like you know where you're standing." Emily held her gaze. "I'm learning where I'm standing." "Good." May picked up her bag. "Now show me this house. I was promised a room and work." Harrison appeared from the barn. He and May looked at each other, and Emily watched it happen, the quick mutual assessment of two people deciding what the other was. Harrison, who could read people the way Emily read kitchens, took about 4 seconds. May, who had spent years working in a saloon and could categorize a person's character before they finished their first drink, took about 3. "Mrs. Harrison says you need someone to run the house," May said. "She's right," Harrison said. "I don't do things halfway." "I wouldn't expect you to." May looked at him for 1 more second. Then she looked at Emily. "I like him," she said. "I know," Emily said. "I told you." "You told me. I needed to check." May turned back to Harrison. "Where do I start?" He pointed at the house. "Tom will show you what's been neglected." "Everything's been neglected," Tom called from across the yard cheerfully. May squared her shoulders. adjusted her bag and walked toward the house with the specific, purposeful stride of a woman who has found a job that needs doing and intends to do it. Emily watched her go and felt in the specific place in her chest where she'd been slowly rebuilding things for 2 months, something warm and right settle in. Harrison came to stand beside her. "You made the right call," he said. "I know. She's going to reorganize everything Tom hasn't been doing." "She's going to reorganize everything," Emily said, Tom included. From inside the house, they heard May's voice. "Tom, what on earth happened to this floor?" Tom's voice. "It's been a few months." May's voice. "It has been considerably more than a few months." Harrison looked at Emily. Emily looked at Harrison. And for the first time since the courthouse steps in the afternoon light of a Thursday in Montana, something happened in the space between them that wasn't practical or strategic, or a wall being navigated, or a piece of shared life being negotiated. Something that was simply the recognition of two people who had found against considerable odds exactly the right person to stand next to. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back, the small gesture of a man who had been wanting to do something with his hands and had found the specific right thing. His fingers brushed her cheek. She didn't step back. She looked up at him with the honest, direct, unguarded attention she gave everything important, and what she found in his face when she looked was not what she'd spent 25 years being told she'd never find there, not tolerance or pity or the specific performance of a man pretending something was true. It was just him, looking at her. The same way he'd looked at her hands in the kitchen of the Broken Wheel Saloon, like they were something worth seeing. "Will," she said. "M," he said. She had never been called M by him. He'd used her full name every time Emily, careful, respectful, the formality of a man who understood that names matter. M was something different. M was what May called her, what the people who knew her best called her, the name that lived inside the formal one and only came out when someone had gotten close enough to find it. She felt it the way she'd felt the bread note on her shelf, as a small thing that was actually very large if you were paying attention. "Don't make that a habit until you mean it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I mean it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The ranch was going on around them. Tom and May debating the floor, the hands drifting back to their work, the horses moving in the pasture, the whole working living reality of a place that required people to keep moving. "All right," she said. "Then you can." He let his hand drop, but the warmth of it stayed on her cheek, and she let it stay, and she turned back toward the kitchen, because supper wasn't going to make itself, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked back into the house together, and the afternoon closed around them, the way good things do, quietly, without announcement, as if this was simply where they'd always been headed and had only now arrived. The first frost came early that year. Emily felt it before she saw it in the particular quality of the silence on a mid-September morning, the way the ranch held its breath differently when the temperature had dropped in the night to something serious. She was at the stove at 4:30 as always, and the kitchen was warm, and the smell of the first coffee was moving through the house, and she heard without surprise the specific sound of Harrison already up and moving. He came into the kitchen in his coat. She handed him coffee without being asked, because she'd known for 6 weeks exactly when he needed it. "Frost," he said. "I know," she said. "South pasture fence needs checking before the ground freezes hard." "Tom's knee," she said. "I'll take Danny and the Reeves brothers." He drank the coffee, looked at her over the rim. "You're worried about the root cellar." She was. She'd been building the winter provisions for 3 weeks with the systematic urgency of someone who understood that 40 miles from the nearest supply point meant that running short in January was not an inconvenience but a genuine problem. The root cellar was good. She'd reorganized it herself in August, and the inventory was solid. But an early frost meant the last of the garden vegetables needed to come in today, not Thursday, as she'd planned. "I'll pull May and get it done before noon," she said. He set down the cup. He touched her shoulder as he passed that same easy contact he'd developed over 2 months, the specific language of a man learning how to reach toward someone without crowding her, and her learning how to not step back from it. And then he was gone into the gray morning. Emily stood in the kitchen and felt the day organize itself around her and let herself for one moment simply be where she was. 2 months and 3 weeks at the Harrison Ranch. 2 months and 2 weeks as Emily Harrison. She had stopped counting days somewhere around the 6th week, which she recognized as a significant milestone of a kind nobody would write in a ledger, but that mattered as much as any ledger entry she'd made. She started breakfast. May appeared 20 minutes later, already dressed and alert, because May's internal clock had calibrated to the ranch with the same efficiency she brought to everything. Frost, May said. Root cellar, Emily said. After breakfast, May said, and poured her own coffee and started helping without being asked, because that was what May did, and Emily had stopped marveling at it and started simply relying on it, which was its own form of trust. The men came in for breakfast and went back out, and the morning moved forward, and Emily and May spent 3 hours in the root cellar with their breath-making clouds and their hands moving fast through the work of bringing in the last of the season's yield. They worked in the comfortable rhythm of two people who had learned each other's pace, and they talked the way women talk when they're doing physical work together. Not continuously, not performing conversation, but in the natural way of people who are at ease enough to let silence exist alongside speech. It was in the root cellar at mid-morning that May said, "You know the whole valley is talking about you." Emily didn't stop what she was doing. About what? About everything. May set down a bundle of turnips. The Deering thing. The survey documents. What you said to Cal Deering and the broken wheel. She looked at Emily. Maggie Horton told me when I was in Dust Creek last week. Said you're all people talk about at the Wednesday social. Emily was quiet for a moment. What do they say? That you walked into that saloon and took a 6-month legal dispute apart in an afternoon, May said. That you found evidence that 3 lawyers missed. That you said to Deering's face what half the valley has been thinking for years. She paused. That Will Harrison married the woman who cooks like an angel and has more sense than most men and doesn't apologize for either. Emily looked at her. They're not talking about your body, May said quietly. Or not the way they used to. Or not, it's not the first thing anymore. You're not the fat cook from the saloon who got lucky with a rancher. May held her gaze. You're Emily Harrison, and there's a difference. Emily looked at the wall of the root cellar. At the shelves, she'd organized the provisions she'd built, the systematic care she'd put into making sure 12 people would eat well through a Montana winter. She didn't cry. She had a policy about that, and it held. But something moved through her that was in the same neighborhood as tears, the specific feeling of something being said that you have needed to hear for longer than you realized. People change their minds slow, Emily said finally. They do, May said. But they change them. Emily picked up the next bundle and kept working. The letter came on the following Monday, and it was the letter she hadn't expected. The supply rider handed it to Tom, who brought it to Emily in the kitchen with the specific expression of a man who didn't know what it contained, but whose instincts said it mattered. The return address was Helena. She saw it and felt something shift in her chest before she opened it. It was from Margaret Deering, Mrs. Harrison. I hope this finds you well and settled into the season. I write with 2 things to tell you. The first is that my husband has formally withdrawn all legal claims against the Harrison Ranch in the territorial record, which I expect you already know. The second is something you don't know. Emily's eyes moved down the page. Cal has decided to sell our Dust Creek holdings and move the operation to Wyoming. He told me this 3 days ago. He did not ask my opinion, which is consistent with how he has run our life together. I am writing to tell you that I have decided not to go with him. I have spoken with Judge Farrow and with a lawyer of my own in Helena, and I am pursuing a legal separation. My father's property in the valley, the land where he made those surveys, comes to me through his estate and does not transfer to Cal in a separation under territorial law. I intend to build something on it. Emily stopped. Read it again. Read the next paragraph. I am telling you this because you are the reason I finally did it. Not directly, but what you said to Cal in the saloon that day, What you said about taking things from people who had worked for what they had. I had been thinking it for 20 years, and watching someone else say it out loud without flinching to his face was the thing that moved me from thinking to doing. I owe you that knowledge. I would like to call on you if you will receive me. Not as Cal Deering's wife. As a woman who needs neighbors she can trust. Margaret Calloway. Deering. Emily sat with the letter for a long time. Then she got up and went to find Harrison. He was in the barn. She handed him the letter without comment, and he read it standing in the barn doorway with the morning light coming in, and his expression doing the specific thing it did when he encountered something he needed to think about before he spoke. He read it twice. He handed it back. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to write back and tell her she's welcome here," Emily said. "She's Cal Deering's wife." "She's Margaret Calloway Deering," Emily said. "And she's doing something very hard, and she asked me instead of a dozen other people she could have asked, and I know why she asked me, and I'm not going to make her regret it." Harrison looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "You're not concerned. I'm not concerned that you're receiving a woman who helped us win the land dispute and is leaving a man who tried to use you as a legal weapon," he said. "No, I'm not concerned." He looked at her steadily. "Are you concerned?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know her. I knew her for 10 minutes by a hitching post." "You knew me for less when you made the decision that mattered." She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew it, and the fact that he'd said it without making a production of it was exactly how he operated, which was one of the things she had come to rely on. "I'll write today," she said. She wrote the letter and sent it with the next writer, and 3 weeks later, Margaret Deering arrived at the Harrison Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 bags and the specific contained composure of a woman who had made an enormous decision and was carrying it with the dignity it deserved. Emily met her at the door. They looked at each other, the same 2 women who had stood by hitching posts in Dust Creek, and exchanged 10 minutes of truth, and something passed between them that was the recognition of people who had been in different ways, and for different reasons, invisible for a long time, and were done with it. "Come in," Emily said. "There's coffee." "Thank you," Margaret said. They sat at the kitchen table, and May brought coffee, and did not hover, because May had the social intelligence to understand when 3 was too many, and Emily and Margaret talked for 2 hours about practical things. The Calloway land, what it had on it, what it needed, the legal timeline of the separation, what Margaret knew about farming, and what she didn't. At the end of 2 hours, Emily said, "Can you cook?" Margaret looked at her. Passively. "Can you learn?" "Quickly when I'm motivated." "You're going to need to feed yourself through winter on land you're developing alone," Emily said. "That's motivation." "Yes," Margaret said. "It is." "Come back Saturday," Emily said. "I'll teach you what you need to know for winter." Margaret looked at her with something that was working very hard not to be relief. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," Emily said. "I'm doing it because it needs doing, and because you can learn, and because out here, neighbors who help each other survive is not charity. It's how the territory works." She looked at Margaret steadily. "You helped us. I'm helping you. That's how it goes." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I've never had a neighbor like that," she said. "You do now," Emily said. The hard twist of Part 5 arrived on a Friday evening in October with a rider Emily didn't recognize. She was in the kitchen making supper when she heard the horse come in fast, and she heard Harrison's voice in the yard, and then a pause that had the specific weight of bad news. She turned down the stove and went to the door. The rider was young, breathless, with the look of someone who had pushed his horse hard. He was speaking to Harrison in a low, urgent voice, and she caught fragments. The miller spread fire 3 families, and then Harrison turned and saw her in the doorway, and the look on his face told her the rest. "The Miller homestead," he said. "Fire took the main house and the food stores last night. 3 families sheltering there for the winter. The Millers, the Kowalski family, the widow Adkins and her 2 boys. They got out, but they've got nothing. Emily looked at him. She looked at the rider. She looked back at Harrison. "How many people?" she said. 11. 4 adults, 7 children. She turned and went back into the kitchen. May appeared in the kitchen door 15 seconds later. "I heard," she said. "The root cellar," Emily said. She was already moving, already calculating what they had, what they could spare. What 11 people needed to get through an October night, and then a week, and then a Montana winter. "I need you on the cellar. Bring up the duplicate provisions, the secondary stock I built for contingency." "That's your winter buffer," May said. "I know what it is." Emily looked at her. "Bring it up." May went. Emily went to the larder and started pulling. She had built this kitchen with the systematic intelligence of someone who had spent years managing under scarcity and knew exactly what efficiency looked like at every level. She knew what she had. She knew what could be spared. She was not sentimental about the winter buffer she'd spent 2 months building, because the buffer existed for exactly this, for the thing you couldn't predict but could prepare to respond to. Harrison came in. "Emily, how fast can Tom hitch the wagon?" He stopped. 20 minutes. "I need 30. Tell Tom 25. She pulled a second basket. "The Millers have children. I need to know their ages." He stared at her. "Ages," she said. "I cook differently for children than adults. Will I need them?" He went and got them. He came back with a list that he'd gotten from the rider, and he read them to her while she packed, and she listened and adjusted and kept moving, and he had the intelligence to stay out of her way and hand her things when she pointed. Tom had the wagon ready in 22 minutes. They loaded it in 15. May stood back and looked at what they were sending: a significant portion of the Harrison kitchen's winter provisions, packed with the organized precision of Emily's best work, enough to keep 11 people fed through the immediate crisis and into a reasonable recovery. May said quietly, "That's a lot." "I know what it is," Emily said for the second time. "Load it." They loaded it. Harrison came to stand beside her while Tom and Danny finished securing the load. "I'm going with it," Harrison said. "I know," she said. "Take Danny and Reeves." "You should come," he said. She looked at him. "Someone needs to start the replacement stock tomorrow." She said it simply as fact. "And someone needs to be here when Margaret comes Saturday." She paused. "And the Millers and the others are going to need somewhere to stay while they rebuild, which is a conversation we need to have when you get back." Harrison went still. "You're thinking about housing them here." "I'm thinking it's October in Montana, and they have children, and we have an empty bunkhouse extension," she said. "I'm thinking we should talk about it when you're back and have seen what the situation is." He looked at her for a long moment. The wagon was loaded. The horses were ready. The light was going, and they needed to move while there was still enough of it. "You know what you are," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Say it." "The reason this ranch is more than a ranch," he said. "That's what you are." She held his gaze and felt the words the way she'd learned to feel things that mattered, not deflecting them, not diminishing them, not finding the angle that made them smaller. Just letting them land where they were meant to land and staying with them there. "Go," she said. "They need the food." He touched her face, quick, warm. Then he mounted and the wagon moved, and she stood in the yard and watched it go, and May came to stand beside her, and they stayed there until the wagon was out of sight. "You just gave away a significant portion of winter provisions," May said. "We'll rebuild," Emily said. "In a month, before the hard freeze. In 3 weeks if we work right." Emily turned back to the house. "I know what I'm doing, May." May was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know you do," she said. "I just like hearing you say it." Harrison came back 2 days later. He came in at noon and she had a plate waiting before he sat down because she'd heard the horses from the kitchen and knew his pace. He ate. She didn't ask immediately, she let him eat because he'd ridden hard and slept little, and she could see it in the way he was carrying himself. When the plate was mostly clear, she sat down across from him. "Tell me," she said. He told her. The Miller house was a total loss, nothing salvageable from the main structure. The food stores were gone, but the families were intact, and the outbuildings had held, and the provision she'd sent had arrived in time to change what would have been a desperate situation into a hard one, which was a different thing entirely. John Miller wept, Harrison said. He said it straight without embarrassment about the fact. When we unloaded the wagon, he's a grown man who's been on this land for 8 years, and he stood in his yard and wept. Emily looked at the table. His wife said to tell you. Harrison stopped, looked at her. She said to tell you she doesn't know you, but she knows what you did, and she wants you to know that her children ate last night because of you, that she'll find a way to repay it. She doesn't need to repay it, Emily said. That's what I told her, Harrison said. She said she intends to anyway. Emily was quiet. She thought about John Miller weeping in his yard, and his wife's message, and 7 children who had eaten last night, and she thought about the provision list she was already rewriting in her head, and the 3 weeks of hard work ahead to rebuild the buffer, and she let all of it be what it was. The difficulty and the rightness of it together, inseparable. The bunkhouse extension, she said. I talked to the Millers about it, Harrison said. They'd take it, temporary through the winter while they rebuild. John has skills he'd work the ranch in exchange. And the Kowalskis, the widow Adkins. Adkins has family in Dust Creek who can take her and the boys. He paused. Kowalski family is harder. They've got nowhere to go, and 4 children, and Martin Kowalski is proud in the way that makes accepting help complicated. Emily considered that. Does he cook? Harrison looked at her. He does not. His wife? She does, solidly from what I saw. Emily nodded slowly. His wife could work here, in the house with May, or in the kitchen when I need help during the heavy season. She met Harrison's eyes. If he's working the ranch with you, and she's working the house, it's not charity, it's employment. He can hold on to that. Harrison stared at her. What? She said. How long have you been thinking about this? Since you left, she said. 2 days is enough time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You know this ranch is going to be a different thing in a year than it is now. I know, she said. Different than what I built it to be. Is that a problem? He looked at her with the expression she'd finally found full words for respect and warmth, and the specific regard of a man who has been surprised by another person so many times in such a short span that he's stopped expecting to stop being surprised, and has found in that surrender something that feels very much like joy. No, he said, it's not a problem. Todd. The Kowalski family arrived the following week. Anna Kowalski was 32, capable and quiet, and quick to understand what a room needed. Emily watched her first morning in the house and made her assessments with the honest efficiency she applied to everything. And what she assessed was a woman who worked with the particular focus of someone for whom work was not just a means, but a source of dignity, and who was currently receiving the specific gift of being allowed to earn what she needed rather than receive it. Emily understood that gift. She understood it in her bones. She was at the stove on Anna's 3rd morning when Anna appeared at the kitchen door with a look that meant she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. Come in or don't, Emily said, but don't stand in the doorway. The heat escapes. Anna came in. I want you to know, Anna said carefully, that I understand what you did for our family. She held Emily's gaze with the directness of a woman who had been raised to look people in the eyes when she meant something. Martin does too, though he won't say it easily. He doesn't need to say it, Emily said. He will, Anna said. Eventually. He's slow to say things, but he says them. Emily looked at her. Are you comfortable here? Yes. The children. They've stopped looking afraid, Anna said, and her voice shifted slightly on the words, the involuntary shift of a mother who has been watching her children's faces for fear and is seeing it leave. That happened fast, faster than I expected. Emily thought about why that might be, about the specific quality of a place where people were treated as worth something where the work was fair and the food was good, and nobody was made to feel like charity. She thought about how that quality moved through a house and what it did to the people in it, including the smallest ones. She turned back to the stove. "There's batter on the left side of the work table," she said, "if you want to make yourself useful before May gets the children's breakfast out." Anna moved to the work table and picked up the bowl and asked one question about what she was making, and then made it correctly, and Emily filed her in the category of people she could work with, which was not a large category, but was the most important one she kept. The morning the final twist arrived, it was November, and the snow had come for real. Emily was at her stove, and the ranch was deep in its winter rhythm, and the Kowalski children's voices were somewhere in the house, and May was managing the household with the specific iron efficiency that Emily had always known she was capable of, and had simply never had the resources to deploy. And Margaret Calloway. Deering had been out to the ranch 4 Saturdays running, and was cooking well enough now to feed herself through the cold months on the land her father had left her. And the Miller family was rebuilding, with John Miller working the Harrison North fence line, and his wife sending over preserves she'd managed to save from the outbuildings, as a way of saying what she'd already said in words. The letter arrived with the morning rider. Tom brought it in with an expression Emily had seen before, the expression of a man who has identified that something is significant without knowing what it contains. The return address was Dust Creek. The handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. She opened it. It was from Peters, the young man from the registry office, the one who had been 22 and deeply unprepared the day she'd put a ledger box on his counter and told him what she needed. "Mrs. Harrison, I am writing on a matter I believe will be of interest. I have recently taken over the land registry office full-time following Mr. Anders's retirement. In organizing the records, I have found 4 additional Calloway survey documents that were not part of the box retrieved in July. These documents cover the territory from the Harrison North pasture boundary all the way to the ridge line, an area of approximately 600 additional acres that does not appear in any current claim." Emily read it twice. She read it 3 times. 600 acres. Unclaimed, undocumented in the current registry, covered by survey documents that had been sitting in the Dust Creek land office for 15 years, waiting for someone to be thorough enough to find them. She was still sitting at the table when Harrison came in for his morning coffee. She handed him the letter. She watched him read it. She watched his face do the thing it did when something very large arrived. The stillness, the processing, the jaw that settled when a decision was forming. He looked up. "Peters," he said. "Peters," she said. "The 22-year-old who didn't know what to do with us. He's the full registrar now," Emily said. "And apparently he's thorough." Harrison looked at the letter again. 600 acres. In a territory where land was the foundation of everything, of security, of legacy, of the specific kind of permanence that a ranch was built to become. "This needs a lawyer," he said. "It needs Peters first," Emily said. "He needs to hear from us that we're taking this seriously and moving on it before someone else finds it." "Who else would find it? Someone always finds things," Emily said. "Write to Peters today. Tell him we're coming in before the end of the week." He looked at her. "Before the end of the week, it's going to snow again." "Then we ride between snows," she said. He looked at the letter one more time. Then he looked at her with something that had been building in his face all fall. Something that had started as surprise and had slowly over months become something settled and certain and entirely without reservation. "Come here," he said. She looked at him. "Will, M." He said her name the way he'd been saying it since October, that particular way, that was not a formal address, but an intimate one, the name inside the name. "Come here." She got up from the table and went to where he was standing, and he put his arms around her, and she let herself be held fully, and without the old impulse to manage the contact, without measuring how much space she took up, or calculating how she looked, or armoring herself against something she hadn't decided yet to trust. She just let herself be held. He held her the way he did everything, with steadiness and without performance, with the specific warmth of a man who has learned what he has and is not careless with it. His chin rested on top of her head, and she could feel his breathing and the solidity of him. And outside the snow was holding off, and inside the house, May was laughing at something one of the Kowalski children had said, and the kitchen was warm, and the morning was going on the way mornings do. 600 acres, he said quietly. We'll verify it first, she said into his shoulder, then celebrate. You are extremely practical, he said. Yes, she said. I knew that about you from the second day. What did you know from the first day? He was quiet for a moment. She felt him thinking the specific way he thought honestly without shortcuts. That you were the kind of person who makes a place better by being in it, he said. Without knowing that was what you were doing. Emily went still. She had heard those words before. He had said them about Elsie on the ride to Dust Creek. She was the kind of person who made a room better by being in it without knowing that was what she was doing. She had heard him say it and filed it in her careful collection of things to understand later. And later had become now, and she understood it. He wasn't comparing them. He was telling her that the thing he recognized in her was the same thing he recognized as worth everything, the specific quality of a person who improves what they touch without requiring acknowledgement for it, who is simply constitutionally an asset to the world they occupy. He was telling her she was that. She pressed her face against his shoulder, and she breathed, and she let it be what it was. Will, she said. You're going to make me late for the morning bread. He made the sound that was definitely a laugh. He held her for one more moment. Then he stepped back and looked at her face with everything in his expression that he'd been slowly learning to put there over 4 months. I'll get the horses ready for Thursday, he said. Wednesday, she said. Beat the snow. Wednesday, he agreed. He went out. She turned back to the stove. May appeared in the doorway with 2 of the Kowalski children behind her, and the morning opened up around her the way mornings did, now full real inhabited. She made the bread. She made it the same way she always made it, the way her mother had taught her and her mother's mother before that, with the particular combination that was hers and had always been hers. She worked, and the house went on around her, and through the window she could see Harrison crossing the yard, and Tom coming out of the barn, and the sky holding its snow for one more day. She was Emily Rose Harrison. She was 25 years old. She had come from a kitchen behind a saloon where nobody said her name like it meant something, and she had built in 4 months a life that was so full she sometimes stood still in the middle of it just to feel the weight of it, the good solid real weight of a life that was entirely hers, not because someone had given it to her, because she had known what she was worth. Even when nobody else did, even when the arithmetic came out wrong, even when she was pressing her burned hands flat against a kitchen wall in the dark and telling herself not to cry. She had known. And she had waited not passively, not with resignation, but with the patient certainty of someone who understood that the right thing would eventually need a woman exactly like her, exactly as she was, and that when it did, she would be ready. She had been ready. She was ready now for everything that was coming, the 600 acres, the Wednesday ride, the winter ahead, the spring that came after the years that would follow the spring. Ready with her burned hands, and her mother's recipes, and her honest eyes, and the particular stubbornness that had kept her standing in rooms where she was meant to feel small and had never quite managed to feel small enough to satisfy anyone. She pulled the bread from the oven. She set it on the rack. She called out, "Breakfast." And the house answered her. May's voice, the children's feet on the floor. Tom's heavy step from outside Harrison's voice, from across the yard saying, "Be right there." The whole, living, breathing, imperfect, real sound of a life full of people who showed up when they were called. That was the thing she had been cooking toward all those years in all those kitchens. Not a man, not a rescue, not a story someone else would tell about her. Just this people who showed up, and a table long enough to hold them all.